frogmen, not wanting to die, turned to their commander Oboy in a panic, asking what they should do, since arrows did not damage the creature. However, he himself did not know what to do. They had no time to think of a better plan. For the next moment, Manon jumped on Oboy, who was closest to him. He was an experienced warrior, and a second before he died, he managed to dodge, which put the head of his inexperienced kin right in the reptile's mouth. Realizing that this monster was no match for Cockatrice, and that it was almost impossible to make eye contact with such a fast creature, he decided to throw poisonous toads into its jaws. Manun, like a dog seeing a bone thrown to him, instantly caught it and swallowed it. Thinking that maybe the reptile was vulnerable to poison, Oboy shouted to his warriors to throw all the poisonous toads they had, which they immediately did. Not about to give up the free tasty snacks, Manun began to catch the toads flying at him. Watching this performance with disdain, Yahello asked the lizard behind her what they were doing, to which he replied that they were throwing poisonous toads from their pouches. But she said that she had seen it herself, but what she was more interested in was why they were throwing their snacks around, which she thought was very strange. After a moment's thought, he replied that perhaps it was an act of goodwill. Yahello grinned wickedly at this, then turned to Manun and told him to explain that it was too late for that. One of the blessings they had received from the god was the blessing of resistance to poisons, which was crucial at the moment. Seeing the evil smirk on Manun's face, who was looking at him like he was lunch, Oboy realized that his foolproof plan had failed, but there was no time to do anything about it. For in the next instant, the huge reptile leapt at him again, and this time without missing a beat. In the frogman village, traces of blood could be seen everywhere on the ground, while their houses burned with fire. A frogman sitting in the bushes with a bow was aiming at someone. In the next instant, the arrow was speeding through the air towards its target, which was Rakrak, who was walking somewhere. However, even though he could not see the arrow coming at him, thanks to his excellent instincts, he was able to sense the approaching danger and reflected it with his massive tail, while Ur, who had arrived in time, neutralized the archer with a single blow. When he approached Rakrak, he informed him that it looked like this frogman had been the last, adding that Seong-un had indeed abandoned the village and fled when he sensed danger. To which Rakrak replied that one of the reasons for this was the betrayal of the grayscale lizards who were currently fighting against the frogmen with them, then adding that even so they had no right to criticize them, as it was their choice. However, what he was really interested in, and what he thought was really strange, it was why, despite the criticality of their situation, the great Allroy they had only heard about did not show up. Sunwoon, who was watching them from above, smiled, pleased with himself, then quietly muttered to himself that it was all because of him. Among the countless tactics and strategies used by him, there was one that was probably one of the strongest in the game, and it was called disease. It worked and was effective in any era. It was a tactic he decided to use this time. Even though he had some trouble finding the right virus, since it was only supposed to work on the mucous membranes of amphibians, he still managed to do it. The time when Rakrak followed Stargazer to the southeast, where the tribe of frogmen was located, coincided with the time when Sunwoon discovered the virus. And even though the virus and the frogman tribe were hundreds of kilometers apart, he successfully managed to transport it to them thanks to his insect army, who, despite many casualties along the way, eventually made it to their village, where he first infected their leader, the Great Allroy, who has since disappeared. At the same time, the sounds of drums could be heard around the island, banged by several frogmen. On the ground near the water, several bound grayscale lizard cubs were kneeling. Realizing they were here for sacrifice, they tearfully awaited their fate. Not far away on the ground sat the Great Allroy, whose body was covered with a layer of white slime, and who had initiated the sacrifice that he believed would heal them. Together with a crowd of his tribesmen, who knelt before the lizard cubs, bowed and begged the two-headed god to accept their sacrifice and to kill all those lizards, thus showing them his greatness. Soon, someone's huge shadow appeared under the water, with two pairs of eyes glowing in it. At the same time, Seong-un reached the island by boat and saw that his father had already started the ritual of the sacrifice, which he believed was the key to their victory. At the same time, in the nearly destroyed lower village of the frogmen, Rakrak was called loudly by someone's excited and panting voice. Turning around, he saw Owen, who was breathing heavily from running. Praising Owen for a job well done, Rakrak asked him why he was in such a hurry and what he wanted from him. He said with desperation in his voice that they needed to get to the island right away. Rakrak was puzzled as to why they had to get to the island now, and he said that the frogmen had lizard cubs there to sacrifice. Then he added that they had a god, and that if they sacrificed to him, he would come and do them a small favor. And though he might not be able to cure their disease, he would probably attack Rakrak and his warriors. Rakrak sighed and said that he should have told him about it earlier, for now they had no way to get to the island, for Seong-un had taken all the boats in his escape. Owen did not want to give up, and started to say that if they swam, they would be able to get to the island. but he was immediately interrupted by the harsh voice of Rakrak, who looked at him coldly and said that it was too dangerous, because they had bows, and they didn't swim as well as they did. Owen's eyes filled with despair at these words, and in the next instant, his fatherly instinct kicked in, making him beg him to help his son and the other kids. However, this only made Rakrak angrier, who immediately punched him in the jaw. He shouted at him furiously, saying that he should have confided in him earlier and told him everything from the beginning. Then he told Owen, who looked at him with horror and despair on his face, that he believed that they could defeat the god the stupid frogs believed in by their own strength, and that if their god appeared and attacked them, he would show him how they could destroy him. When he calmed down and stopped shouting, he looked pityingly at the still sobbing Owen. Though he couldn't imagine his pain, he knew it was incredibly hard for him, so he just asked if he thought he should have told him earlier so they could have saved his son. At the same time, Jowl stopped behind them, and after dealing with Oh Boy, she got back on Manon. She immediately turned her worried gaze to the island in the middle of the lake. Owen didn't think Rakrak had said anything wrong, for he realized that things would have changed if he had only been able to learn of Shunan's intentions earlier, and perhaps if he hadn't acted so late, none of this would have happened. In the next instant, the water near the island was churning. Allroy, shouting incomprehensible words, joyfully reached out to the creature that appeared from under the water. This creature turned out to be a two-headed devil, which was their god. Without wasting time, Allroy immediately pointed to the gray lizard cubs, who, seeing the monster, clung to each other in fear, and then he said in a reverent voice that it was his offering. Raising his hands in the air, he began to shout in a fanatical voice to punish the black-scale lizards who dared to disturb the god's lake. Looking at the huge two-headed monster that looked invincible to him, Owen finally lost hope. However, while he resigned himself to his fate, Rakrak along with Yahello looked at the two-headed devil with calm gazes. Despite its enormous size, Rakrak thought that fighting this huge two-headed serpent might be worth a try. After all, even though they didn't have a location advantage and couldn't use any tricks, they had a chance to win, even if it cost some sacrifices. However, the very next instant, he noticed something that made his eyes widen wide and glow. A butterfly flew towards him, glowing with a blue light. This could only mean one thing: they had hope. Walking over to the desperate Owen, Rakrak called out to him and told him to look at him. He raised his head in bewilderment and looked at him with his tear-wet eyes, which widened the next moment at what he saw. Standing in front of the huge mantis that appeared before them in the moonlight, Rakrak turned to Owen and asked him if he believed in miracles. Kneeling before his god, Allroy shouted loudly to his tribe to worship the two-headed devil. He again began fanatically shouting to the monster to accept their offerings and destroy the lizards. Shunan bowed his head and watched as monster approached the victims, but at one point the monster stopped in indecision and looked forward. With Allroy's experience, this god had always been hungry for sacrifices, and always as if he had been starving for days, had rushed at them, but to his surprise, this time no such thing had happened. Wishing to know what monster was looking at, he followed his gaze and turned around cautiously. His eyes widened at what he saw, and he instinctively froze with fear. There was a large shadow above the tall trees, belonging to a huge creature with large eyes, which at the mere sight of it inspired awe and terror. The sounds of this creature's movements were accompanied by the cracking sound of trees bursting out of the ground, which immediately made the frogmen bowing to the two-headed devil turn around. Like their leader, they also froze with fear when they saw the creature approaching them. Shivering in fear, someone from the crowd loudly exclaimed, "It's new god." Their fear was understandable, for looking at this creature, it was clear that compared to him, the two-headed devil was just a pathetic water snake, while he really looked like a true god. When creating his creature that would follow his will, which was made possible by the fact that he had the essence of the abomination that was left after killing the ancient Scolopendra, Sun Woon decided to focus on practicality, adding strong legs as well as wings, sharp jaws, and large eyes that allowed him to see in all directions. Although the resulting creature resembled a mantis, it was a completely different organism. He guessed that at that point there probably weren't many players who had been able to create their own creature before him. Let's go back to the two-headed demon, who was confused and furious when he saw the creature approaching him, because if he let the creature that had invaded his territory stay, he would have to give up frogmen and sacrifices. And so even though his opponent seemed large and strong, he was not about to back down, for he himself was a divine being. Already in the next instant, it opened its jaws and rushed at him. Stretching out one of his arms, the mantis easily squeezed one of the heads of the snake that was trying to attack him. Crawling out onto the ground and colliding with the mantis, the snake crushed several frogmen with its body. Seeing this, the rest of them started to run away screaming in panic. Shunan barely managed to drag his father away. Despite the fact that he was almost killed, he continued to watch the monster fight with horror. Not wanting to give up so easily, the serpent opened its second mouth and tried to attack the mantis again, but like last time it was not successful. The mantis neutralized the attacking head with one strong blow. Then turning to the snake in a quiet voice, which despite this was heard by all the lizards near the lake, he said that if he dared to call himself a god, he should realize that he was in fact nothing. Olroy and Shunan, who were watching, had a look of horror on their faces. Then grabbing the serpent's remaining head, which was still showing signs of life, the mantis said he would offer it to his creator, so that he could atone for his stupidity. For his stupidity was not a sin. In the next moment, illuminated by the bright light of the moon, he pompously tore off its head. Then, under the gaze of all present, turning to the dead serpent, he said that his sins were forgiven by his blood and flesh. Even Sun Woon, who was watching, was surprised, as he didn't expect that he would win so easily, because even though there was a big difference in skill and level, he still had high hopes for the two-headed devil. However, he decided to think about it later, because his main goal was to help the tribe of lizards, who saw the victory of their god and began to shout with joy while Owen cried again, but this time, with joy. Seeing the joy and happiness on the faces of the lizard men, Sun Woon thought to himself that the emotions he was experiencing were quite entertaining. Turning back to the corpse of the two-headed demon, he noted that his abilities weren't too bad, considering that he had a small area, not a large one, unlike the others. But he hadn't used it, which suggested that the reason was this creature wasn't created by player. Another reason to rejoice was the system window that appeared in the next moment, informing him that for killing the two-headed devil, he had received its essence, as well as the small area it possessed. In the next instant, another system window appeared in front of him, asking him if he wanted to check out the new territory. The fact that he was able to obtain another essence and a new territory so quickly could be attributed to nothing but luck. So without thinking long, Sun Woon confidently pressed yes. The next message that appeared after his choice made him unconsciously smile. After all, it said that he had obtained a small patch of water. However, the only problem was that he didn't need it now, because the lake had no access to the sea, which made him decide to put it aside for now. A boat pulled away from the shore. The lake was water red with blood. In it sat Olroy, still trying to believe the truth of what was happening. Shunan looked at his father, who seemed to have lost his mind after the death of the serpent. He thought to himself that it was not the disease that had made his father weak. It was the fact that they were completely enchanted by the power of the two-headed devil, who at that moment seemed invincible to them. And at the last moment, they did nothing but hide behind him, and when he lost, there was nothing left for them to do. At the same time, Sun Woon approached the mantis, who, seeing him and addressing him as the creator, said that he had done his will, to which he continued to look at the island and replied that he had indeed done an excellent job. Then he added that he could rest until the next time he called him. Disappearing, Mantis said in a respectful voice that he would do his creator's will again when the time was right. He looked once more at the lake, which was silent. Sun Woon turned his gaze to Rakrak and said that he was not the kind of lizard who did nothing at times like this. Seeing the surviving frogmen fleeing in boats to the upper village, Rakrak cheered his warriors and shouted that they would win a complete victory today, then asked if there were any volunteers to take them to the upper village of the frogmen. He was immediately approached by Owen, who said that he wasn't that tired yet and that he needed to meet his son on the island anyway, and said he would do so. But he was not the only one. The next moment, several more gray lizards asked Rakrak to let him help them as a thank you. He looked at them and replied that their bodies were not fit for battle and they would not be able to fight, to which one of them replied that he too had once been a warrior, adding that warriors were not the only ones capable of killing frogmen. Then pointing to his kin, who despite their wounds were willing to fight even with sticks in their hands, he said that he might think it was cowardice of them to do so only now, but the sight of them fighting made their hearts burn, the first time they had felt that way since becoming slaves. Looking at them, Rakrak replied that it was like a grudge, to which the gray lizard tearfully replied that it was for the hatred and resentment of losing their life companions, children and grandchildren, made them wish the frogmen dead. As he looked around at the gray lizards once more, he realized that few of them had ever held a real weapon, let alone been wounded, but understanding their pain and bitterness, he could not stop them. So in the next instant he raised his fist and shouted loudly, telling all those who wanted revenge to follow him, followed by the screams of the lizards who were intent on finishing off their abusers once and for all. Rakrak, along with Jael and Ur and the rest of the lizards, began to swim across the lake, and soon all 80 lizards that followed their leader had reached the island. Owen was one of the first to get out of the water. He rushed straight to his cub and gave him a big hug. Watching the happy and somewhat tearful reunion of father and son, Rakrak turned to Ur and told him to send those who were tired on the journey with their children back to the boats, and afterwards to take those who could not swim well and take them to the end of the village to attract the attention of the enemy, who must now be watching closely and waiting for their attack. When he heard this, he asked admiringly if their plan was to use one of the squads as a distraction while the main group swam around the water and stabbed them in the back, to which he replied that it was. Realizing that Rakrak was taking the hardest part, Yor asked a little worriedly if they would be able to get to the island by water without being seen, to which he replied that they would, as the number of those who were able to fight had dwindled considerably, and there were no more than 10 of them left. After a moment's silence, he added that while they were sailing to the island, he had discovered another blessing from the god. Then turning his gaze to the lake, which reflected the bright light of the moon, he said that their scales would shimmer in the moonlight as the water shimmered, making them much more invisible. Now that they had everything ready, all they had to do was get it over with once and for all. After a while, all hell really broke loose in the frogmen village. Rakrak's successful plan had worked, and the frogs were taken by surprise, and realizing that they could not win, began to flee in panic. However, not everyone managed to escape, because those who suffered from itching disease and had problems with breathing could not do it. The great leader Alroy was no exception, as he looked in despair and incomprehension at the lizards in front of him, who appeared as if from nowhere. The realization of what was about to happen to him brought a look of horror to his face. Soon the lizardmen warriors arrived and reached his guards, who were left to protect him. But as it turned out, they didn't stand a chance against the strong and sharp spear-wielding lizardmen, who dispatched them in the blink of an eye, so fast that the frogmen didn't even have time to fire their bows at them. After killing all the guards, Rakrak looked at the lone Alroy with a cold stare. But even in such a situation, and having long since lost his dignity, he began to scream in despair, accusing the two-headed devil of not saving him, despite the sacrifices he had made. But his cries did not last long, for in the next instant the spear of the reluctant Rakrak was thrust into him, thus ending once and for all the great leader Alroy, who despite his big name was nothing more than an empty man blaming others for his failures. At the same time, Seong-un sat in his tent listening to the war cries of the lizards, as well as the panicked cries of his kin, with terror on his face. Shivering with fear, he pondered how it could have happened like this, and how their numerical and weapon advantage had vanished in the blink of an eye. Even the poison that should have been their trump card did not work on the lizards, who were somehow immune to it, but it was too late to think about it, because they had already lost. After a while, the shouting and noise outside subsided. Deciding that this might be a good chance to escape, he cautiously peeked out of the hut to make sure that there was really no one outside. However, he didn't even realize that the danger was closer than he had imagined. Suddenly, a voice sounded behind him, causing Seong-un to freeze in place with fear. In the next instant, he turned around in panic, at the same time reaching for his quiver, which unfortunately for him, was empty of arrows. Staring with his eyes wide with fear, he shouted the name of the lizard in front of him in desperation. It was Rakrak. Looking at him with a cold stare, he told Seong-un if he was a warrior, he should stand up and bear his sword, as it would at least allow him to keep his honor. However, the man had no honor now, and all he could do was just beg to be spared. He immediately panicked and started reminiscing about how they had strengthened their friendship over the last few times they had met, adding that he had no animosity towards the lizards. Rakrak asked thoughtfully if that was true, and he replied that it was, because it was the two-headed devil that had threatened them. Seeing that the lizard still seemed unconvinced by his words, Seong-un pointed to his bow in a panic, saying he would reveal its secret, to which Rakrak indifferently and coldly asked what the secret was. He immediately replied that it was the bowstring. And when the lizard asked him what the bowstring was made of, he replied with a playful smile that it was made of veins from the backs of frogmen. Rakrak, like Owen, was really shocked at what he had heard, and his face immediately darkened. Even though he had assumed that the bowstrings were made from some animals, he had never imagined that they were made from their kin. The next moment he asked Seong-un, who was sitting in front of him with a smile on his face, what the bow itself was made of. The man, realizing what he was about to say, mumbled that it was from lizards. Seong-un lowered his head and prepared to die, for he knew that after his words he would not be released. Rakrak heard the answer and replied in a cold and grim voice that he understood. Then opening the curtain at the entrance to the hut and looking out, he said that there were really no hard feelings between them, and he had already won a brilliant victory, so he accepted the deal he had offered. He then looked at Seong-un and added that he was free to go. Seong-un looked around warily and rose to his feet, still not fully believing that he was being let go. Not waiting for Rakrak to change his mind, he started to run away. Owen, who was standing next to Rakrak, asked him if he was really going to let him go. Rakrak took his bow and arrow and said yes. Then taking aim at the fleeing Seong-un, he coldly added that all he needed was a moving target. Not long after the frogmen were finished, Rakrak's arrow whistled through the air. It hit the head of a bound, rotting, and long-dead frogman. Judging by the number of marks, it had long been used as a target for training. Now Rakrak was pleased with the result. His archery skills had improved greatly, and their tribe had found a way to make bows as good as the frogmen. However, he just wondered if this was the best they could do. Even Owen, who had been watching the training, had noticed that the quality of this bow was just as good as the frogmen's and its arrows flew just as fast and far. Rakrak explained to him that they had achieved all this by replacing the material of the bowstring with frogmen tendons. But still, the lizards were physically stronger than the frogmen and could pull the bowstring tighter and risk breaking such a bow, so they should have found stronger materials. Owen understood his desire for a better weapon, but he still reminded him that the bows made by the frogmen were the best that could be made in this forest. There just weren't any better materials here. That's true, Rakrak said, nodding. Then I guess we can't just stay in this forest then. Owen was smart, so he assumed that the reason for this decision wasn't just to make a better bow, and that was indeed the case. Rakrak explained to Owen that he had learned from the Stargazer that this forest area would become very cold as winter came. The lizards would become physically weaker, but would still be able to survive the winter by making fires and wearing the skin of other animals. The problem, however, was their pet water buffaloes. Rakrak knew that in nature, water buffalo go to warmer places to avoid winter and find places with enough grass. And to solve this problem, some of them will have to go to warmer places to breed water buffalo further. You may have noticed by now that Owen had a skull on his head that was different from those worn by Rakrak warriors. There were no warriors among the grayscale lizards, but there were definitely those that had the right qualities and abilities to become warriors. Rakrak had tested and selected them himself, and Owen was one of the gray lizards who had become warriors after passing several tests. These new warriors insisted on using frogmen skulls rather than buffalo skulls, and Rakrak allowed them to do so. Rakrak continued practicing and shooting at the target, hitting one arrow after another. Finally, he asked Owen about the results of today's hunt. He replied contentedly that he and his squad had wiped out the remnants of the frogmen hiding in the forest nearby, and now, thanks to their carcasses, there would be no shortage of materials for making bows. Rakrak was pleased to hear that. However, Owen still couldn't forget what had happened in the village. How he and the other lizardmen, blinded by hatred and rage, had pursued and killed the unarmed and begging for mercy frogmen. Nothing seemed to quench their thirst for vengeance. And their last victim that night was Seong-un, who had betrayed his tribe and revealed its secrets, and then tried to escape. It was not a pleasant memory, and he was brought out of it by Rakrak's question. He asked Owen what was bothering him. Owen replied that he would like to have Seong-un or Alroy's skull as a reward for helping him someday, and asked that the skull not be damaged in training. Rakrak was fine with that, and promised him that he would be sure to get his. Owen was grateful for that and decided to tell him about an interesting place they had discovered in the forest while hunting. Yahello, meanwhile, came over and quietly leaned over the gray lizard cub who was watching the leader with an unusual figure in his hands. Yahello asked quietly, interested in listening to the adults. She frightened the cub. He immediately burst into tears and let go of the figure. Then Yahello asked him what he was doing here and what he wanted to ask the chief. Suddenly, she noticed a figure lying on the grass. She picked it up and asked what it was. It looked suspiciously like the giant praying mantis that their god had sent to help them. Yahello showed the figure to Rakrak, and he also thought the figure looked like their divine protector. They all liked the way the figure was made, and the chief even asked the cub if he had made it himself. Rakrak praised him, saying that the figure was nice and cute. Hearing this, the cub just glowed with happiness, and then he offered to keep the figure as a gift. But Rakrak was not sure whether it was worth taking the toy away from the child, and looked questioningly at Owen. He replied that it was fine and he could accept the gift without any regrets, for the children of his village had been making a lot of them lately. It is even popular among them to exchange such figures. Hearing this, Yahello asked the child if there were many children in their village who knew how to make such figures, and he answered her that yes. He explained that it all started because the protector had then saved them all on the island from imminent doom. Now all the children of their village thought of him as a good and powerful being who could protect them from any misfortune. Hearing this, Rakrak and Yahello looked at each other. Rakrak realized that these figures could be very useful, and decided to see how many had been made so far and buy them all. Owen offered to go to their village and see. Rakrak agreed. He was willing to use all his resources to get more of these figurines. He saw this as an opportunity to spread the belief in their unnamed bug god. But that would come later. For now, Rakrak wanted to know what Owen's squad had found during the hunt. It turned out that while hunting the frogmen, they had found a strange structure inside one of the caves where some of the frogmen were hiding. It takes about half a day to get there from the lake, and their squad killed all the enemies without much trouble. But the cave was a bit strange. Rakrak was immediately interested and asked what he meant. Strange in what sense? Owen explained that when they entered the cave, they noticed that there was another entrance that seemed to be carved into the stone, and he himself still doesn't understand how they were able to carve something into solid rock. So, he thought then that all should be told to the tribal chief first. It was the right decision, and Rakrak decided to equip an expedition and explore everything with his own eyes. He returned to the village with Owen and Jaeol to take a group of warriors with him, and together with them he set off. On the way, Owen advised them to be careful and cautious, for the frogmen were hiding there for a reason, and some of them might still be lurking nearby, preparing an ambush. Finally, they came to the very same cave. As soon as they entered the cave, a blue butterfly appeared out of nowhere and immediately caught Rockrak's attention. While Owen assured everyone that they had cleared up all the frogmen here and they could not worry about anything, they all froze in surprise as they stared at this slab of stone. Though Owen still didn't seem to understand what was so special about it. It was like a circular passage somewhere further into the cave, closed off by a man-made door made of carved stone. Looking at it, Rakrak marveled at how breathtaking it looked, and he didn't understand how such hard stone had been carved so precisely. Jael noticed something else interesting. The pattern on this stone was very similar to the one on the back of the giant scolopendra they had defeated in the desert. Now Rakrak himself realized it as well. Sunwoon already knew that these were ancient ruins. He knew that there were many types of ancient ruins, and in them one could gain ancient knowledge or discover relics and wonders. Among the ruins, there were some that had useful functionality, some were unique, but there were also demonic ruins that carried a lot of danger. Now, while the level of development of his civilization was still low, even if they found ancient knowledge in the ruins, it would be of little use, since his civilization simply wouldn't understand anything and wouldn't be able to use them. The situation was slightly different with miracles and relics. They allowed to create or change resources, and could also grant mystical blessings for civilization, but they had one disadvantage. They were fixed in one particular place and could not be transported in any way, which made them also not so valuable to the nomadic tribe. Still, in Sunwoon's opinion, getting into the ruins wouldn't be so bad if they weren't demonic ruins. Apart from ancient knowledge, rank knowledge, secrets, demonic ruins, and unique ruins, players usually obtained other things that were categorized as miscellaneous relics. There could be piles of insignificant treasures, such as the golden tablet already obtained by Rakrak. This would have been of great value in the Middle Ages or a later era, but they weren't at that stage of development yet. So Sunwoon decided to wait and see what would happen, as it seemed that Rakrak's curiosity and boldness would not lead to a bad scenario. He, watching Rakrak try to push back the stone door, thought that the likelihood of these ruins being unique was very slim. At the same time, probability that ruins might be demonic and full of trouble was very high. Finally, the stone slab yielded under Rakrak's efforts. Immediately, a multitude of lightning bolts appeared, which formed a portal. It turned out that behind the stone slab was a portal to another world. Notifications appeared in front of Sunwoon congratulating him that his civilization had successfully discovered the ancient ruins. Finally, the system announced to him, "Welcome to the demon world." Once inside, Rakrak and the rest of the group began to move through long arched bridges that zigzagged and led somewhere downward. When they found one of what she thought was the safest of the stone bridges, Jael told Rakrak that they would most likely have to walk across it. He sighed heavily and replied that it would be good if they could jump down and not waste so much time looking for the right path. Jael looked worriedly at Rakrak and asked if he was going to pray to their god, to which he continued to look down and said no, as he didn't want to bother him with such trivial matters. He also added that he would not be able to go down alone. Jael looked at Rakrak's face and wanted to ask if it was because it wouldn't be fun, but in the end decided not to say anything. After some time of discussing their next steps, Rakrak, Jael, and Owen came to the conclusion that the best thing for them to do for now was to keep moving on the bridge. After a while, however, the first difficulties appeared on their way, in the form of a huge army of not-so-friendly rodents that blocked their path. When Rakrak saw the rodents, he asked what they were, to which Jael, who was walking behind him, replied that they were gutters, adding that he had probably tasted them several times before. He replied that he knew what they were, adding that it was their size that surprised him, for they looked much larger than the ones they had eaten before. In addition, the surprising fact was that these rodents, unlike ordinary nutria, moved in groups and also behaved aggressively. Owen, who had also seen a lot of things in his life, said that it was the first time he had ever seen such a thing. Rakrak said they would just call them rat monsters. Assuming that they might just be defending this place and that a battle would be inevitable, he shouted for everyone to get ready and take up arms. Just a moment later, the rat monsters rushed towards the lizard men, but even though the enemy had a numerical advantage, they managed to kill all the rats without much difficulty thanks to their experience and spears. Looking at one of the dead rats, Rakrak asked if they could eat them, to which Jael replied that they had no reason not to, and nothing bad was going to happen if they gutted them and took them with them. However, she had another idea, so she immediately asked Rakrak what he thought about trying to raise them like the buffalo. He didn't have time to answer, however, because Owen, who had overheard their conversation, suggested that they try raising fish. His words surprised Rakrak, for in the swamps and ponds where he used to live, the number of fish gradually decreased as they were eaten and eventually disappeared. However, Owen, who used to live with aquatic frogmen, knew that this was not the case in large ponds. So he explained that the fish also lay eggs and give birth to baby fish, which caused the frogmen to warn them against fishing during the breeding season. To do so, they simply needed to build a dam so that the young fish could not escape. Raycrack realized that it would be very difficult for them to do this in a large and deep lake, but he did not say so out loud, as he thought their efforts would be worth it in the future. Suddenly, however, his thoughts were interrupted by a bright light and a scream behind him. Quickly turning around, he saw the lizard holding his arm in pain, as well as screaming that the rat monster was still alive. Hearing this, Raycrack approached him and asked if he had been bitten, to which he replied, still in pain, that he had not. He added that he had just touched him to disembowel him, but suddenly felt pain. Looking at the rat monster, who was staring at him with rage in his eyes, Raycrack decided to check it out for himself. So despite the others' warnings that it could be dangerous, he reached out to the monster. In the next instant, a bright spark formed at the spot where he touched it, followed by many small bolts of lightning that caused him great pain. Raycrack knew the concept of static electricity from touching furry skin in the winter, but it was too painful to compare to this, so he yanked his hand away sharply. Then holding his hand, he replied to the concerned Yahello that he was fine. However, out of everyone present, only Sunwoon, who was watching what was happening, realized what it was. The system window that appeared in front of him reported that it was a nutria in a demonic state, with the attribute of lightning that could deliver an electric shock to the opponent it touched. His worst assumptions had indeed come true, and it did indeed turn out to be the ruins of a demonic castle. However, this was not necessarily bad news. After all, if Raycrack along with his group managed to break through these demonic ruins to the end, there was a good chance that they would be able to obtain demonic power. Speaking of magic, acquiring it didn't make the owner a wizard right away. Acquiring it opened up the possibility of studying it. To use magic, one had to learn spells, and spells of this type required the study of ancient ruins, all kinds of ancient knowledge and magic. However, those who possessed demonic magic were powerful already because they possessed it. Moreover, it became stronger from generation to generation, which gave them the ability to create strong wizards in future generations. However, demonic magic had disadvantages, and all because in the perished world, divinity and magic were in conflict. After all, magic originally came from ancient evil, not from the gods. And so if demonic magic was obtained, there would be penalties in obtaining faith points, obtaining which at the beginning of the game would result in a lot of variables that could make it very difficult to progress further. At the same time, Raycrack, who was sitting near the corpse of a rat, heard a voice asking him if he needed such power, and the next moment he looked up and saw a bright light, which appeared to be coming from a transparent creature like a stingray, which was floating in the air. The creature turned to him again and tantalizingly asked him if it was not an interesting power, and then added that if he wanted it, he could always get it. The creature's words were interrupted by Yahello, who turned to Raycrack and said that if things were bad, they could always go back, to which he agreed. Turning to the rest of the lizards, he ordered them to match the other rats, as well as check their weapons and prepare themselves. He turned back to the unknown creature and wondered if he was the only one who had seen it. The creature said that he could hear him if he spoke to him mentally. Raycrack immediately asked what it was. The creature replied that it was a spirit that protected the ruins, and that it was only seen by those with great power. Raycrack immediately thought that this was probably a lie, but this thought was not conveyed to the spirit, for deeper thoughts and feelings were not conveyed to it. Sunwoon, who was observing all of this, wondered if he should have warned Raycrack. After all, there was a magical combat spirit in front of him who would definitely try to seduce him. However, upon opening his stats, he discovered a new deception ability that had not existed until not too long ago. Seeing it, Sunwoon was a little surprised, assuming that Raycrack had been able to develop it by dealing with Shunen's tricks. After a moment's thought, he decided not to interfere, as their leader's new ability gave the lizards a chance to handle it on their own. At the same time, the magical spirit, when asked by Raycrack what this ability was, replied that he was referring to electricity, which was the power to burn other creatures and create light and fiery heat. He then added that he could give him that power if he wanted it. Raycrack replied that if he could give it to him, he would be grateful. However, the spirit said that it was not that simple, for he also had a condition. Raycrack frowned at this, saying that he had not heard of any conditions. The stingray replied that it was not such a difficult condition, and that his strength should have been enough to fulfill it. Raycrack turned around and said that if he wanted to make a deal, he should have said so from the beginning. He looked at the spirit with a frown. He advised the spirit to first state the terms if he wanted to make a deal, and to have an appropriate attitude. Hearing this, the protective spirit immediately apologized. Raycrack got to his feet and looked coldly at the spirit and told him to be specific about what the terms were and what he wanted from him, for if he withheld anything, there would be no further conversation. Rakrak asked the stingray what his terms were, what did he want in return, and once again reminded him that if he hid anything from him now, there would be no further conversation. The electric stingray flew closer to Rakrak, but now his fluttering seemed less violent than before. Still, he did not answer immediately and began from afar, explaining that he had been sealed in these ruins for many millennia. Yahello, who hadn't heard this mental conversation, came up behind Rakrak and said that all preparations were complete, and they had collected all the spoils. Now they could leave. But now their leader didn't want to rush anywhere and told them to wait a little longer. Rakrak asked and thought what he meant by sealed. Then the stingray patiently explained to him like a child that it meant he was trapped or imprisoned here. And even though he could fly freely in this space, he could not go out of here. Finally, he named his condition. He wanted to free himself from this restriction, and then he could give the power of electricity to whoever freed him. Rakrak immediately asked, "What would it take to free you?" He replied that it was simple, and if Rakrak went down and killed the guardian who was guarding the seal and broke it, he would be free and could give him his power. Rakrak wondered if he could then do the same thing the rat monster did, with the day's power the stingray would give him. The one laughed a little at the way he named his power and assured him that of course he could, and even more impressive things would be within his grasp. Now seeing Rakrak's interest, the electric stingray excitedly explained that this power is called electricity. Using this power, Rakrak would be able to perfect it and amplify its effects to the point of being able to summon a destructive thunderstorm on the heads of his enemies. This power could become so powerful that it would be comparable to that of the gods. But Rakrak didn't seem to understand what the stingray was telling him and only asked what else he had to offer. Then the stingray proudly announced that the power he possessed was so powerful and boundless that not only Rakrak himself but also the members of his tribe could use it. But that was not all. This power could be passed on to their descendants. The progress in strength they had made would not be passed on directly, but if their descendants continued to train their strength, some of them could become even stronger than he was. When Rakrak heard all this, he couldn't help but think how amazing it all was. But still he had a logical question. Why was a stingray with such a marvelous and useful power trapped here? He answered without hesitation that it was because its power was too strong. And humans and other intelligent beings stay away from dangerous things like poison or monsters and anything else they don't understand. In case they can't stay away from them, they trap them and lock them there. And that's what happened to him. Suddenly Rakrak stopped him and warily pointed out to him that he himself had just said he was dangerous to others. Rakrak looked at him suspiciously and confidently stated that he was hiding something, and perhaps it was because there was more harm from the stingray's power than good. The stingray tried to argue that no, that's not true, and that if you have that power, then… Rakrak immediately stopped him and advised him not to lie anymore, and warned him that he could go back right now and block the entrance to this cave, which seems to have been blocked for no apparent reason. Then he could also order his warriors not to let anyone into that cave and warn all the descendants of my tribe to never enter there. Because of such threats, the electric stingray was clearly in a panic. The prospect of spending a few more centuries in prison did not please him at all, and there was no way he was going to give up. Rakrak turned around and pretended to head for the exit of the cave. The spirit of the stingray immediately followed him, begging him to listen to his story, for now he would tell him everything. As far as Seong-un knew, the intelligence level of spirits was not that high. However, it was not easy for those who entered the demonic ruins to resist the temptation of the spirits. Still, as expected, Rakrak behaved very cunningly because of his new ability he had obtained. This new unique ability of Rakrak was cunning. Seong-un decided that this ability was most likely due to Rakrak figuring out Shunen's tricks and being the first to successfully attack the frogmen. Rakrak still wanted to possess this power, so he suggested, "Why don't they start the deal again, Pez?" Scat didn't understand who he was addressing, but Rakrak said that, from now on, that would be his new name. But he still resented it, saying he wasn't Paz. Rakrak insisted that their deal starts with him choosing his new name, and those are fair terms since the Scat was trying to trick him. He had no choice but to agree. The next thing Rakrak asked for was an explanation as to why the stingray was dangerous. After all, he thought, if Paz really had a power worth making a deal for, there was no reason to hide why he was dangerous. If there was a reason to hide, however, then it wasn't worth making a deal for. PZ hovered in the air and agreed to take the risk of telling him that he was descended from ancient evil, or rather from creatures that had ruled this world many millennia ago. Rakrak wondered which ancient evil he meant. Paz answered that it was those who ruled this world many, many years ago. But it was so long ago that everyone had forgotten about their existence, and even the gods did not remember them. Even he himself could not remember his origins, for he had simply opened his eyes one day and found himself trapped here, imprisoned for an unknown amount of time. However, to the stingray's surprise, Rakrak was not frightened by his origins, and even more so said he felt sorry for him. He told himself that he grew up an orphan and it's not that important to know what you were born as. It's much more important to decide what you're going to do with your future. Pizai was a little discouraged at being comforted by Rakrak's words, but soon went on to explain his danger. A power of unknown origin intoxicates sentient beings. Since the source of the power is unknown, it allows the creature to believe that the power belongs to him alone, when in fact he obtained it by accident. Once he begins to use such power, he begins to believe that he deserves it, and if he begins to think so, he looks down on those who do not possess the power. Rakrak found this a little hard to understand at first, but he nodded, remembering the examples of Bor and Shunin, who were intoxicated by their power. Now he asked, demonic magic also causes creatures to become like that, right? PZ confirmed his hunch. Indeed, its power spread indiscriminately and unchecked. This meant that the wielders of his power were chosen randomly and that carried certain risks. Rakrak tried to predict what would happen to his tribe if he obtained this power. This electric demonic power seems to be different from the one given to their bug god. The god's power is only given to those he chooses, and at his discretion. On the other hand, if someone gets this kind of power without having earned it, others will be jealous and envious. And if there are more and more of them, there will definitely be lizards who will despise God and turn away from him. Moreover, this power would only grow more powerful as time went on. Now Rakrak understood why Peas and his power were so dangerous, so he asked why he had to risk so much to gain that power. PZ insisted that his power was useful, attractive, and would be able to give him an advantage in battle, but it was still destructive. Then another electric shock ran through Paz. Rakrak thought he had seen a light like that somewhere before, and finally realized what it was. It was like thunder and lightning in the sky. He assumed that the strength of the energy determined the intensity of the light it emitted. At first it might just be a small spark, but when the force grew and became stronger, it could turn into thunder and lightning. He also realized that it would be advantageous in battle if he could generate electricity from his body like the monster rats did. It was indeed an attractive power. He was snapped out of his musings by Peas, who once again asked if he would free him. Rakrak replied that he would, but he had a condition. He wanted to avoid accidentally spreading the power among the tribe. PZ flew up to Rakrak and asked if he wanted the power himself, didn't he? He understood such a desire, and suggested that it would probably be difficult, but still possible. However, there were a few things that would then be needed. In order for a single lizard to have this power, a ritual of the same level as magic would have to be prepared. But Rakrak shook his finger negatively. He didn't want to keep the power to himself alone. Rakrak recalled that he had said that the power of electric demonic magic spread indiscriminately, but if necessary, one person could take possession of it with a ritual. If both of those statements were true, then couldn't the power also not be distributed indiscriminately, but distributed to certain select people? Paz looked puzzled. He replied that he hadn't tried it, but he thought it was possible. Such a small ritual should work, but why did Rakrak need it? If he wasn't going to take all the power for himself, the result would be about the same as if he left it to chance. Then Rakrak explained, "No, it's different. If the power is only given to certain members of the tribe, it will look as if they were chosen by God himself. In other words, it will not be a power of ancient evil that has no source, but a power with a clear source of origin. This one will look like a God-given power, but even that is not the most important thing. If the lizards think it's a gift from God, then it will be. What difference does it make? The chosen ones will think that God has given them strength, and their faith and devotion will reach God, even though they are gifts, not from him. From this, their faith will be strengthened, and they will be afraid to disobey their deity." PZ tried to contradict Rakrak, but couldn't think of what to say. What Rakrak was saying directly applied to the perished world system. If demonic magic holders believed that they had gotten it by chance, then accruing faith points would incur penalties. On the contrary, if demonic magic holders mistook it as a power given to them by a god, it would result in increased faith points. Rakrak decided to move on to the next condition. PZ was surprised at how many conditions he had and tried to resent it, but Rakrak reminded him that if he persisted, the conditions would only get more. Stingray had no choice but to agree, and he only asked him not to delay and just say the condition at last. However, Rakrak looked at him carefully and announced that he must also believe in their bug god. PZ was shocked at the suggestion. How could he, a demonic spirit, believe in their god? PZ flashed a look of denial. How could he believe in any god when he himself was descended from beings more ancient and powerful than the modern gods of this world? The rest of the terms were good, but it would be difficult. He reminded himself once again that he was a spirit of demonic magic that had been created from a being that had been around longer than the gods. Rakrak gave him a displeased look and reminded him that it doesn't matter who gave birth to you, how or why. What matters is what you are going to do next. And then asked if he wanted to be free or not. PZ still resisted, saying it was a ridiculous idea because gods don't like demonic spirits. After all, they're just made that way. That's their nature. Demonic spirits compete with the gods and want to spread their demonic magic to as many creatures as possible. That's the purpose of their existence. Rakrak was starting to get angry and advised him not to compare his god to the others, and don't judge their god through the prism of your view of the world. He explained to the stingray that he thought he was useful enough, and their bug god happens to be very generous and gracious to useful creatures. Their god might even listen to his wishes and fulfill them. That is why the reason why the stingray was created is not important at all. The reason for its existence is determined by any intelligent creature itself, not the one who created it. Sun-Woon watched all of this closely. PZ steadily slowed his fluttering and hesitated in doubt. He knew very well that gods didn't like spirits of demonic magic and tried to destroy them. So he asked again, would their god really accept him? Rakrak was sure of it and assured him that if he accepted all the conditions he offered him, he would be accepted. Rakrak was sure that he did not know all the desires of his god, but he was the one who understood his desires better than any other being in this world. PZ was silent, but he had already made his decision. He looked at Rakrak and finally told him the whole truth. He had indeed lied to him about some things. In fact, he's not just stuck in these ancient ruins, he rules them. The truth is that the challenger in these ruins must defeat the guardian of the ruins, but that guardian is under his rule. He controls everything in these ruins, and he is the one who sent the enchanted nutria with demonic magic to them. Rakrak wasn't surprised at all, and Paz went on to say, the reason I told you is that you must defeat the guardian. But Rakrak didn't let him finish his sentence and finished it instead, saying that he knew why he said that. It was because the power shouldn't go to the weak because they wouldn't be able to spread it widely. He was right. Recently, even a tribe of frogmen had come to take up the challenge in search of power for revenge, but they had failed. But now Pease was wondering how Rakrak would react to all this. After all, he had revealed his lies. Wasn't he upset? Rakrak shook his head calmly as if nothing had happened. He had already expected this. And he wasn't the kind of lizard man who would get upset just because he had been deceived. After all, he hadn't even lost anything from this lie. PZ didn't understand what was going on. Then Rakrak said, I can always forgive if I want to. Forgiveness is not a warrior's virtue, but I am also a tribal leader. And forgiveness and reconciliation is indeed a necessary virtue for a tribal chief. All the more reason for such behavior, since he lives in a place as damp and dark as this, and only has eyes for monster rats all the time. Rakrak thought that he could use some fresh air and looking at the beautiful things outside. Hearing this, Pease glowed with gratitude. Then Pez said, I still don't know your name. What is your name? The leader of the lizard men fairly introduced himself. Hearing his name, Pease soared and announced that Rakrak had successfully passed the test, and he accepts all the terms he offered. Finally, he asked if Rakrak agreed to the deal. Of course he agreed, but there was still one last question. Would their bug god accept the demonic spirit as his subordinate? A system window appeared in front of Sun-Woon that said that the demonic magic spirit wished to be subordinate to him. If he agreed, he would gain control over the domain of demonic magic. Electricity. After a short time of thinking, Sun-Woon clicked yes. Now the deed was done. This was the only possible way to overcome the penalties of demonic magic due to the transfer of demonic magic to the realm of divinity. Otherwise, every creature possessing demonic magic would be labeled as enchanted with demonic magic and would be unable to produce the right amount of faith and control their power. However, demonic magic in the realm of divinity was under the control of a deity. Sun-Woon praised Rakrak for his good work. Thanks to him, once Pease accepted the terms of the deal, Sun-Woon was able to grant demonic magic to certain of his servants without penalty. Transferring it to the divinity realm doesn't make it divine. It can't even be developed like other abilities in the divinity realm. There are many restrictions, but not receiving penalties is already a victory, isn't it? If obtaining demonic power only required breaking through the ancient ruins, it would be too easy. Rakrak's group would win even if they were attacked by hundreds of monster rats, and Sun-Woon could always support them using points of faith. However, subduing a demonic magic spirit was much more difficult. Sun-Woon didn't even know if he would be able to do it. The only way to find out how successful they were was to wait and see what would happen depending on each character's abilities. And it seemed that Sun-Woon had gotten lucky again and succeeded by unlocking an area of demonic magic. Electricity. However, Sun-Woon didn't consider it a mere coincidence, and it seems the fact that he met an injured Rakrak in the desert was luck for both of them. 9 years later, near one of the altars to the nameless blue bug god, two figures stood on top of the hill. In front of them stood a tower of tombstones and water buffalo bones, stacked and assembled from plaster to build a structure tall enough to be seen from afar in the desert. This bone tower was built on top and was created by Rakrak. It served not only to demonstrate belief in the blue god of insects, but also as a landmark in the present day. After finishing telling the long story of how the blue bug god had given the legendary leader Rak the power of thunder and lightning, the black-scale lizardmen carefully wiped the dust off one of the stone monuments. This lizard man wore expensive layers of cloth called silk, indicating that he belonged to a high social class. The traveler only said enthusiastically, "Wow, that was an interesting story." The stranger asked what the bug god had to do with thunderstorms and lightning, and how could he control these powers. The lizard man tilted his head. However, he did not seem discouraged by the question. Rather, he simply asked why this man was asking about such obvious things. He answered him very simply by pointing out what color lightning was. Since it was usually blue, it meant that it obeyed their blue bug god. The man didn't quite understand what the lizardman meant, and thought that lizards were always convincing the strangest things, and they themselves were so strange. However, this human didn't think that being weird was necessarily a bad thing, and hoped that he could take advantage of the fact that they were weird. Hiding his innermost thoughts, he asked the lizard, "Come to think of it, I didn't even recognize your name while I was listening to this long story. My name is Hui, and what is your name?" But the lizard was cunning and was in no hurry to answer. He interrupted their conversation by saying, "Wait, there seems to be some uninvited guests coming from over there." Where the lizard was pointing, a group of armed gnolls were coming up the hill. This hyena-like species had protruding muzzles and black spots on their brown bodies. They had a violent temper and were obsessed with power, so they often fought amongst themselves, but the general consensus amongst the perished world players was that despite these flaws, they were noteworthy. Their physical abilities and intelligence were on average high, so they were considered a good race to get at the beginning of the game, no matter how small the player's zone was. But these facts about the game had nothing to do with the lizard, which turned out to be Owen and the unknown man beside him. The man turned to Owen. "What are you going to do? As far as I know, the gnolls and lizardmen are not on the best of terms right now." Owen replied that there was still time before the top of the hill and they could think about what to do. They didn't even seem to have noticed they were being watched yet. The lizard asked the man if he thought they were Salkate's gnolls. Salkate was the leader of a tribe of gnolls, the tribe of severed ears, who were feuding with the black-scale lizardmen. These two tribes were the two largest tribes in the desert, so all the other smaller tribes showed great interest and respect for them. Salkate and Rak believed in different gods, and so the leaders of the two tribes inevitably feuded with each other. The man next to Owen was very interested in whether the two tribes were going to war, and if they were, who would win. No human tribe, at least in this wilderness, could compare to these two powerful tribes. But judging by the number of these gnolls and their armament, they didn't belong to the Salkate tribe. They looked more like mere wanderers in search of sustenance. Owen noted that the man's arguments were well chosen and most likely true. He thought the same, but unfortunately he couldn't rely on guesses. He needed to know for sure, so he drew an arrow charged with electricity to find out after he had neutralized all the gnolls. Marching along the sandy road and not looking up, the group of gnolls never noticed Owen. Watching them from above, he told the man that unlike the scouting parties of other races or tribes, those were just ordinary hungry marauders. Had there been a group of humans or lizards in front of him, he might have trusted them, but he had no trust in the gnolls. Watching Owen, the man saw the man reach for the bow hanging from his shoulder. Upon seeing it, the man immediately recognized it, for it was the famous compound bow of the black-scale lizards. It was made from large water buffalo, and was considered one of the best and longest-range bows on the continent. However, what surprised the man the most was why Owen had pulled out his bow even though the gnolls were still quite far away. Verbally refuting the man's thoughts, Owen pulled an arrow from the quiver hanging from his belt and fired. Owen walked down the hill a bit, but the distance between him and the gnolls was still well over 100 paces. At some point, one of the gnolls managed to sense the danger approaching them, causing it to raise its head in bewilderment. But even though the gnolls didn't react in time, the arrow never hit any of them. With a flash of blue lightning, the arrow slammed into the ground next to them with a distinctive sound. Hearing the noise, some gnolls looked at the arrow in bewilderment. Unlike them, however, their leader realized something when he saw the arrow, and in the next moment, horror began to appear on his face. Suddenly, electricity discharges and a bright blue light began to emanate from the arrow stuck in the ground. Realizing what was about to happen in the next moment, the gnoll leader screamed with horror on his face that it was an enemy attack and ordered everyone to run away immediately. However, it was already too late. The gnolls, who were feeling rather carefree, could not even think that an arrow stuck in the ground could hurt them. Therefore, not having time to react in time, all they had to do was watch with horror and confusion on their faces as a bright lightning bolt struck from the sky straight into the arrow. Already in the next moment, their painful screams were heard. Having struck the arrow, the lightning struck with an electric shock all the gnolls that stood nearby. This caused the fur of all these vagabonds to stand up and the screeching of wounded dogs among the desert rocks. From the mouth of one gnoll, whose body was still filled with lightning bolts of electricity and who looked at Owen with horror in his eyes, only one word escaped his lips: the Chosen One. Despite his ignorance, even someone like him had heard the legend of the black-scale lizard. He remembered its contents. Therefore, realizing what they were facing and even experiencing the power of this legend in person, he immediately made the decision to retreat immediately. In the next moment, he got to his feet and shouted to his kin to run away immediately. They didn't need to be told twice, as they realized that they had encountered something inexplicable, something that was beyond them. At the same time, Owen watched the panicked gnolls fleeing with a satisfied smile on his face, while the man behind him could not hide his surprise. As the man came to his senses, Owen turned to him with a smile and said that his name was Owen and he was glad to meet him, but hearing such a famous name, the man could not even believe who was standing in front of him. He asked him if he was really the legendary storyteller Owen. Howie could not believe his luck. He was lucky to meet such a famous member of the lizard tribe, even one of its leaders. Owen sighed heavily. Looking into the distance, he muttered in a tired voice that it had been a long time since he had last used his power. Then turning to the man, he motioned for him to take a short break and talk some more. Owen pulled a long stick out of his silk coat. The end of the stick was round and empty. The contraption was strangely reminiscent of a smoking pipe. Then he lightly flicked his finger and formed a spark. As the dry grass caught fire, Owen took a deep breath. As he exhaled, white smoke billowed from his mouth. Watching the lizard, the man remembered that the stick in his hands was a smoking pipe. According to the stories, it was used by a select few black-scale lizards as a ritual tool with which they smoked tobacco after using their powers. Taking a drag, Owen once again exhaled white smoke from his mouth. Noticing the man's silence, he told the man that if he had a desire, he could ask him about things that interested him. Not wanting to miss such an opportunity, the man directly asked why he was submitting to someone else when he had such a strong skill himself. Seeing that Owen didn't react to his words, he explained that he wasn't talking about betrayal and trying to oust the current tribal leader, adding that there would surely be others in the black-scale lizard tribe who would follow him. And even if there weren't, with that kind of power he could easily find another tribe of lizards somewhere and live a comfortable life. For, as far as he knew, Owen's storyteller had been known as a lonely and dangerous vagabond before. And now, instead of living a life of comfort, he was somehow forced to wander the wilderness alone. The man wondered what he was missing out on and what he didn't realize. After listening to the man, Owen exhaled another cloud of white smoke. Then smiling as if he had heard a funny story, he replied that he had his reasons. Turning his gaze to the man looking at him with puzzlement, he said that he had too many sins to live such a carefree life. The man could not believe his words, for he had heard that many lizards respected him on par with High Chief Rak. Looking at the man with his unchanging expression on his face, Owen said that many members of his tribe had indeed forgiven him and no longer held a grudge against him. However, for him personally, it was a matter of personal atonement, redemption for having once betrayed many of his people, but there was a way for him to redeem himself. Now his raison d'etre was to go around telling stories about the blue bug god and Rak, the leader of his tribe, and sometimes using his power to prove to unbelieving fools the power of their god by instilling awe in them. This was the path of redemption he had chosen for himself. Now his life's purpose was to be a prophet of the nameless god of the blue bugs. In honor of their god, their tribe had erected many altars made of water buffalo bones, along with memorial stones that recorded the stories of their tribe's life and the miracles their god had blessed them with. Watching Owen dusting the sacred stone, the man asked him why he had worked so hard for all this. For there was no one in this desert who did not know the Black Lizard tribe and their deity. Owen's work seemed pointless to him, and in his opinion, there was no need to try to improve the reputation of Rak, leader and priest, for he was already legendary. Owen, still wiping the stone, replied that a reminder never hurt anyone, and using his power he constantly reminded everyone of the power of their god and tribe. In his opinion, it was a worthwhile endeavor. Finally turning to the man, he asked him where he was going. And was he a wanderer, like himself? Howie scratched his beard thoughtfully and replied that he was. He would have liked to stop there, but seeing the attentive and distrustful look of the lizard, he realized that he would not leave him until he got a proper answer. He said that he came from Automation. Automation was an isolated valley located in the southwest of the wilderness. A human tribe settled where the springs flowed, and at the entrance to the valley stood a fortress made of earth, stones, and clay. It was called a fortress, but it was not actually built by humans. It was called Automation because, thanks to the ancient mystery, there were ancient mud soldiers that reached human height who constantly rebuilt the fortress when it collapsed. Because of this, the human tribe that managed to occupy the place was able to defend themselves from other large tribes. Automation was also a place that was watched over by gnolls with cropped ears and black-scale lizards. I see. So you're the errand boy of automation? Owen asked. Howie wasn't going to hide anything anymore and replied, Exactly. I'm on my way to the black-scale lizards to deliver the words of the Lord of Automation. Owen now realized that it was his fault for not recognizing the messenger in the guest right away. But everything went well, and they immediately found common ground and no unpleasant mishaps occurred. Howie asked him what he meant by good. Owen explained that he was really lucky and he was going to visit Chief Rakrak himself and could take him with him and show him the way. But it was quite late today, so Owen suggested that they set off early the next day at dawn. Hui wondered why at dawn, and the lizard man explained to him that he was going to navigate by the stars. He also added that since Hui was his guest, it would be his duty to treat him with all generosity. Suddenly, Owen whistled loudly. A stomping sound was heard, and an unknown creature began to approach them, kicking up dust. It turned out to be an overgrown rooster with a lizard tail and more than 2 meters tall. When Howie saw it, he was frightened and asked, What is cockatrice doing here? He was ready to run away, but Owen stopped him by telling him to calm down, and taking the creature by the reins, he added that he hadn't guessed. It was a quorka, not a cockatrice. This particular specimen was called cockadoo, and like all quorkas, was the result of crossbreeding a cockatrice with a common chicken. I don't know how the lizard men ever came up with such a thing. Quorka was a creature that only a small portion of the lizardmen warriors could ride. It resembled a cockatrice in general, but was smaller, more gentle, and less wild and willful. The black-scale lizardmen were unable to tame the cockatrice, but they were able to crossbreed them and obtain quorkas. Along with the chosen ones, these warrior riders on quorkas were one of the main reasons why the black-scale lizardmen had both fame and prestige as well as a bad reputation. Black-scale lizardmen ride quorkas that can run several times faster than humans, and shoot their composite bows hundreds of paces away, hitting a target. At dawn the next day, Owen saddled the quorka and motioned for his guest to sit beside him and set off. Hui did not know what the price for the honor of riding the quorka would be and was nervous. Owen advised him to relax, for in return he would only be required to listen to stories. When they were on their way, Hui asked what the stories would be about. Was it about the blue bug god or about the legendary leader Rakrak? The lizard only replied that it was about both. To the surprise, not only of Hui, but of Owen as well, the tribe of black-scale lizards was not far away at all. Owen had expected them to go farther away. A herd of water buffalo could be seen in the distance, and as they headed toward the huts they had built, they heard crying. Hui inquired cautiously, Is there a funeral there? Owen nodded. Apparently, Owen guessed what kind of funeral it was. The black-scale lizards held different funerals for people of different status, but today it seemed one of the chosen ones had died. A little while before, under the dark clouds, many developing tribe standards with buffalo skulls could be seen developing in the wind. The tribe was just leading water buffalo and moving leisurely through the desert. In front, Rakrak sat on a quorta. A messenger approached him from behind, bringing sad news. Rakrak immediately inquired if Stargazer had asked about him. The messenger replied that he had, and he said that his life was now at stake and he would not be able to speak to Rakrak unless he came to him immediately. Rakrak immediately ordered the procession to stop and make a halt as he was going to stay here for the day. The faithful Ur immediately repeated the chieftain's order loudly and commanded the procession to stop. While Ur stopped the tribe, Rakrak hurried to the sick Stargazer. He was met by Yahello, who was alarmed by the halt of their procession and wondered what the problem was. Rakrak replied that apparently Stargazer wanted to see him. He also says that his life is at stake. Since this old sage had correctly predicted the days ahead of us, as well as his own, he would probably be right this time. Then looking at the confused Yahello, he explained that the Stargazer was always good at predicting the future, and she should already prepare a funeral for him. The old Stargazer had been ill for a long time, and life was slipping from his body every day. The tribe's healers believed that he was now living his last hours, and was on high alert for a meeting with their deity. Yahello lowered her head and told the departing Rakrak not to worry, and to leave everything to her. Even quorkas, as if sensing the oppressive and heavy atmosphere, lowered their heads. Zhao looked up at the starry sky, which was soon to be joined by another star, and muttered to herself that it was going to be a sad night. Heading towards the tent where Stargazer was for the moment, Rakrak reflected on who he thought he was. The old lizard had done a lot for him and the rest of the black-scale lizards. He had many names: Old Tramp, Elder, One-Armed Lizard, Conductor, and Stargazer, but now the tribe members most often called him Elder. It was because of his leadership that their tribe could be where they were now. He also taught him and the rest of his tribesmen how to read the stars, which had saved them many times and kept them from getting lost. And often at the end of another busy day, Rakrak would sit with Stargazer, tired but with a languid expression on his face. Stargazer would sit with his back hunched but his eyes shining, and they would exchange questions and answers. Rakrak usually gave gifts to thank Stargazer for constantly teaching the young lizards his wisdom, even though he was old and tired. But Stargazer always declined the gifts with a wave of his hand. Despite the age difference, they got along very well, and even bantered with each other often. Thinking back on their time together, Rakrak suddenly realized that it would all be over soon. A part of his heart began to tear, as if from that realization. When Rakrak entered Stargazer's tent, the herbalist standing next to his bed looked at him tiredly. Rakrak immediately wondered if he was all right. Somewhere in the back of his mind, however, he already knew the answer to his own question. Herbalist rose to his feet and replied sadly that the elder had lived too long and was now very tired. He had studied and taught many creatures, traveled to places where no one had ever set foot. As if to confirm his words, Stargazer said that he was very tired. As if flipping through his life's memories, he concluded that he had indeed done a lot of things in his life. He remembered how he had traveled and visited many places and countries, learned many new things. Like everyone, sometimes suffered setbacks, in one of which he even managed to lose an arm. One of his most precious and pleasant memories was the one in which he met him, Rakrak. However, all good things always come to an end. Lying on his bed with his eyes closed, he told Rakrak in a peaceful voice that there was only one cure for his illness, in which he felt tired and exhausted. Sleep forever. As soon as the herbalist quietly left the tent, only Rakrak and Stargazer remained in it. The next moment, sadness was reflected on the face of even a brave and strong warrior like Rakrak. He had conquered tribes, challenged the leaders of other tribes as well as powerful monsters, but at this moment he was completely powerless. Powerless over something that no one could influence in any way. Sitting before the elder in the lotus posture and bowing his head, Rakrak said that he had heard that he wanted to see him. Smiling, Stargazer replied that he wanted to indulge in some extravagance before he left, and steal some time away from the busiest man in the tribe. Hearing his words, Rakrak asked what he meant by extravagance. Laughing, he replied that he thought time was a very valuable resource. As a man who had lived his life without greed and without taking what belonged to others, he wanted to at least indulge himself at the last moment. Rakrak smirked and said he didn't think he had called him to his room just for one last joke. Continuing to stare up at the ceiling of the tent, Stargazer replied that he was right, and he did want to see him to ask a question that no one but he would be worthy of answering. He also told the man to think of it not as a question for the tribal leader Rakrak, but as the high priest who had been chosen and was closest to the god. He sat down facing Rakrak and looked at him with his cloudy eyes. Whereupon this Stargazer asked, "What will happen when I die?" Such a question was asked by every living intelligent being, and Stargazer was no exception. But what could Rakrak promise him? Addressing Rakrak not as a tribal leader, but as the high priest who was closest to God, Stargazer asked, what would happen when he died? Rakrak was silent. He wasn't sure either. The creatures told different stories. For the past few years, the black-scale lizard men had been fighting great battles and warriors were dying. However, Rakrak could not understand where the souls of the dead went. At the funerals, he prayed for them to go to a good place, but there was no way to know if they had actually gone to a good place, at least not until he himself died. Where were they going? Were they dreaming because they were asleep? Maybe eternal sleep? Maybe they're having an eternal dream where they don't know who they are or why they're there and can't figure anything out? Or, Stargazer looked worried, and so did Rakrak. Turning to Rakrak, he asked if he also thought that after death, eternal nightmares awaited them. A little hesitant, he replied that he wasn't sure. He was also not sure why he thought he was worthy of answering that question. Stargazer, on the other hand, had his own thoughts on the matter. The blue insect god had saved them when they were lost, and so he believed that he would guide them even after death. After expressing his speculation, he asked Rakrak if his thoughts were different from the actual god's will. The latter thought for a while. Although he did not know the exact answer to this question, he felt that he was completely right. Therefore, he answered that he was not wrong. After all, the blue insect god who had guided them all the time before, guided and helped them when they faced difficulties, would surely continue to guide them after death. Hearing this, Stargazer asked Rakrak with a somewhat satisfied expression what he thought the place he would go to after death would look like. He also asked dreamily if it would start with them standing before their god and awkwardly greeting him. After hearing this, a smirk appeared on Rakrak's face. He then replied that it probably wouldn't be that boring. Rakrak crossed his arms and added dreamily that in his opinion, there was going to be a huge space there, so you could run around in the green grass as much as you wanted. A space where every time you took a step, there would be a slight crunch and the tip of your tail would swish pleasantly through the meadow. In addition, there should also be a large boulder to rest on when you feel tired, and also a blue sky. Lots of sky, That one could stare at without stopping. Stargazer tried to visualize the picture Rakrak was describing. The image would bring a smile to his face. As he continued to put the picture together, he asked Rakrak what the weather would be like there. He replied that it would always have to be nice and sunny. After a second of thought, however, he added that it probably wouldn't, because it wouldn't be fun if it was all the same. He also added that it would be nice if there was a river. Stargazer stared upwards and said that he would like to have a house where he could rest. However, it should not be the tent he usually lived in before. After all, a tent conjured up associations of moving. He wanted a sturdy and cozy home where he could settle in and enjoy the views of all that beauty. Stargazer was also a guide, so Rakrak regretted not knowing sooner how the man felt. However, Stargazer had nothing against his former way of life. After all, he had found the place where his heart had settled, and so as long as he lived, he had no other grievances. However, what was to happen after death was a problem. Stargazer also inquired about the one's thoughts on food. Looking at the starry sky that was visible through the hole in the tent, Rakrak replied that he could probably eat as much as he wanted. Smiling at his words, Stargazer said that a place like that should probably really have everything. However, even with everything there, he thought that he would probably be lonely in such a large place. Rakrak shrugged his shoulders. In his opinion, there should have already been those who had gotten there before him. Because of that, he shouldn't be lonely there. Hearing that, Stargazer cheered up a bit. Another thing he was interested in was the stars. After all, they were something he had studied and been fascinated with throughout his life. Rakrak, who wasn't sure if there was an afterlife, answered affirmatively that there was. His certainty sounded so convincing, as if everything was obvious to him. After all, hadn't the stars been showing them the way all along? And most likely there would be those wandering there too, so God would surely have placed the stars in the sky so that they could easily find their way back. Suddenly, Rakrak's gaze was caught by a blue light coming from somewhere above. It was a blue butterfly that was glowing brightly. It slowly descended straight towards him. It was a sign. A reply from the blue insect god. A sign that he had heard them. Rakrak smiled, for it meant that the blue insect god was listening to their conversation. Rakrak slowly brought the butterfly's hand up to Stargazer's eyes so that he could see it more closely. Even so, he did not react. When he asked him if he could see it, he only replied that there was darkness before his eyes. Rakrak realized that Stargazer had already lost his sight and that death was coming closer and closer to him. He felt a pang of pity. The blue butterfly was known in the black-scale lizard tribe as a sign of positivity and wonder. Even if it wasn't the butterfly that glowed with a mysterious blue light, the lizardmen always rejoiced when they saw a blue butterfly, considering it a good sign. Stargazer would surely recognize it. Rakrak was tormented when he suddenly remembered his time spent with Stargazer studying stars. Turning to him, he asked if he had been here. When Rakrak received a quiet affirmative answer, he whispered quietly in Stargazer's ear that he had brought him a gift. When he heard that, he smiled. He asked if he was thinking of fooling around again. To which Rakrak replied that he was not planning. Let him refuse his gift again. "I'll find him right away this time," muttered Stargazer and smiled. When his last breath reached the blue butterfly, it flapped its wings and began to rise. Rakrak somehow knew it was his last breath. He gently shook Stargazer's body, calling his name. When he was sure he was no longer breathing, he called for the herbalist. The blue butterfly flew out of the tent and continued flying through the sky. It soared over a tribe of black-scale lizards who were busily preparing for the gathering of the camp and the funeral. Then over the desert where dusk had fallen. Finally, a blue butterfly landed on the back of his hand. It was Sunwoo's hand. What happens when you die in the perished world? Sunwoo knew the answer to this question well. The very next moment, a system window appeared in front of him, informing him that the conditions for creating an afterlife had been met and also asking if he wanted to do so. After reading the information, Sunwoo did not hesitate to click yes. Sunwoo knew that one day he would create an afterlife. After the player chose his first tribe and defeated the NPCs in the surrounding area, his divinity level would reach 11. This was one of the prerequisites for creating the afterlife, and the player could reach this level if he played correctly from the beginning. Then his subordinates could become demigods. Up to this point, he had managed to fulfill all the conditions for level, resources, and faith points. However, he still had a condition for the number of deaths. There were 4 conditions to create an afterlife. Reaching the required levels, killing NPCs such as abominations and fiends to obtain special resources, and obtaining enough faith points were the easiest of the 4. But the last condition, death, was unclear. It appeared that one had to achieve enough deaths of creatures that believed in the player, and then the condition was considered met. However, there was no specific formula that could be used to determine how many creatures had to die in perished world, so players had to do the calculations and guess on their own. However, since the conditions had already been met, It didn't matter. Sun-Woon opened the World Creation Helper program. He knew that the day would come when he would create an afterlife, so he would occasionally simulate the different kinds of afterlife he wanted using the World Creation Helper provided by the perished world system. Like the Creature Creation Helper that Sun-Woon had used to create his giant mantis, the World Creation Helper saved worlds that Sun-Woon had created before and worlds created by other players. But just like last time, Sun-Woon decided to create a new one. Even though he decided to create a new world, the basic settings remained the same, making it much easier. Sun-Woon already knew what kind of afterlife each species preferred from his previous experience with the game. Although lizards generally preferred the same type of afterlife, there was a certain type of world that the lizards of the young civilization particularly liked, namely green fields with moist air and warm sunny plains. Sun-Woon felt somewhat relieved to hear Rakrak and Stargazer talk about the afterlife. For the afterlife he had created was not too different from their expectations. The afterlife was a very important element in the perished world, as the view of life after death for those who believed in a god depended on it. For example, if hell was created in the afterlife, the god could show the priests an image of hell through dreams. From the dreams, the priests would learn that the wicked would receive eternal punishment and would pass this fact on to other believers. The concept of heaven was also often used in conjunction with hell. But was there any point in believing in a god if hell was the only destination after death? Punishment should always be accompanied by reward. So a world had to be created in which believers believed they would go to heaven if they attacked a particular species or offended a particular god. And this was more than a matter of faith, since it actually took place in the afterworld. But for now, Sun-Woon could not create an afterlife with heaven and hell. As a result, Sun-Woon could only create one type of afterlife, which was called different worlds. Different worlds were useful afterlife worlds common throughout history. Valhalla, the Waters of Oblivion, Styx, Limbo. They are all different, but they all denote worlds that one can go to after death. These worlds were not necessarily separate worlds, but were most often used as spaces leading to other afterlives. However, this was not the only purpose of these worlds. Even in Valhalla, the afterlife was like a training ground for warriors preparing for Ragnarok. Afterlife worlds can really be different, depending on how players want to use them. If I recall, Sun-Woon even won by using the afterworld well, but at that time, he was just lucky. Souls were immortal as long as the afterlife existed. Using the knowledge or powers that souls possessed was difficult as it took a lot of faith points, but as the game progressed in the later stages, immortal souls became very useful to players. Nevertheless, he decided that there was no need to rush things from the beginning. Many things were still in the planning stages. Sun-Woon called his afterlife First Prairie. It was a working title, giving room for future expansion. The First Prairie then appeared beneath Sun-Woon's feet and could be seen in the World Creation Assistant. He opened the window of his domain and scattered all the souls into the First Prairie. Hundreds of souls turned into blue wandering butterflies and landed on the endless sunny meadow. One of the butterflies was a stargazer, who was now awake. Even though his eyes were still closed, he could still feel the breeze blowing gently against his skin. The freshness of the air he inhaled seemed painfully familiar. Stargazer blinked. He thought death would be eternally sleepy, but when he opened his eyes, he felt rested for the first time in a long time. He lay there, his arms, legs, and tail moving the way he wanted them to. He never thought the pain in his joints would ever subside, not even in his sleep. Stargazer sat up. Immediately an amazing view opened up before him. It was a green meadow. A light wind blew past, and Stargazer felt the moist but cool air on his nose. At first he thought his nose was cold, but soon he felt the warmth of the sun on his face. Stargazer had no trouble remembering his last conversation with Rakrak. The conversation seemed like a dream to him, but at the same time so real and vivid. Rakrak, you were right, this is the prairie we envisioned, but there are no stars or houses of stone here. You can't always get what you wish for. There was a chance the houses in this place wouldn't be needed. Besides, this little thing didn't compare to what he'd already gotten. Stargazer couldn't help but smile. After all, it was truly a wonderful gift for him. Enjoying the pleasant sunlight, Stargazer hummed a tune. The afterlife was much more pleasant and better than he had imagined. In addition, thanks to it, his longtime dream had come true, and he could finally relax in the sun. At some point, however, something caught his eye and made him turn around. As it turned out, he was not the only one who was on this green field. Here and there on the grass lay other lizardmen. They were sleeping facing the sky, with their eyes closed. Stargazer was surprised, but he was more interested in why they were not awake yet. He wandered around, wondering if he should wake up the other lizardmen or not. The lizardmen looked like they were sound asleep, so it was rude to wake them up. Among the other lizardmen, Stargazer saw a few familiar faces. Looking at one of the familiar lizardmen, he recognized him as one of his students and warriors. He remembered that he had been one of his arithmetic students. and had died a few years ago in one of the many wars. One day, the black-scale lizards had been attacked by an alliance of goblin tribes, 4 times the size of Rakrak's clan. 2 groups of goblins split the Rakrak clan's formation into 2. Rakrak, who was in front, and Ur, who was behind, brought their warriors back into formation and began to fight back. However, the children and old men who were in the center of the lizard formation could not do the same. All they had to do was hope for reinforcements and run away since they couldn't fight. But the goblins took that chance and ambushed them. Stargazer, who had seen many battles, realized that they had no way out. And the fact that the goblins were aiming at a place in the formation where there were mostly old men, women, and children was a common military trick. Their only option was to retreat and hold out until Rakrak's reinforcements arrived. The enemy had a numerical advantage, and their tribe's warriors were slowly continuing to be pushed back. The result of such a battle had to be one thing: a loss. In such a situation, Stargazer realized that they were powerless, and this was their end. The goblins were already approaching them, about to massacre them. However, some of the warriors went against the leader's order, because they thought it was necessary and abandoned the battlefield and came to the defense of the old men and children. They were few in number, and did so after making sure that without them, the formations would not be broken. They apologized to their comrades and rushed to their aid, despite the fact that the goblins were dozens of times more numerous than they were. Each knew their lives were on the line, but they couldn't risk the future of their tribe just like that. Thanks to the lessons of Stargazer, they knew how to count, and now it seemed to them a reasonable price to pay to save many others at the cost of one life. It was then that one of the warriors turned to Stargazer and said that he was glad that he had learned to count, and he was grateful to him for these lessons. Stargazer could not stop him. He was firm in his resolve, as were several other lizard warriors. They had disobeyed the chief's orders to come here to help because they thought it was the right thing to do. And thanks to their heroic sacrifices, which no one wanted, the weak lizardmen were able to escape and wait for the reinforcements, which by then had already managed to defeat the main forces of the Goblin Tribal Alliance. But that precious time was bought at a high price. Some of those brave warriors survived their heroic act, but most did not. The lizard warrior standing in front of Stargazer was one of those who did not survive. At the funeral of the warriors who had fallen in that battle, Rakrak went into a rage and began yelling at those who survived, and even those who died at their own funerals. He even yelled at Stargazer. He was sure it was all because of that damn arithmetic he had taught them. Stargazer himself realized some of his guilt, but still asked why he thought it was because of arithmetic. Rakrak thought so, for it was those warriors who were smart and good at arithmetic who had gone against his orders and rushed at the goblins. From the outside, they seemed so stupid, especially when they said that by sacrificing one life, they were saving 2. They decided that it was a good exchange. However, none of them paid attention to the fact that old men and children can't protect others, but warriors can, and by dying themselves they leave the tribe defenseless. Then Stargazer looked at him incredulously and asked, "So you think the warriors were wrong to face the goblins who tried to attack the old men and children?" Rakrak hesitated for a moment and answered, "No." Then Stargazer asked why he was angry. Rakrak gritted his teeth and replied that he was angry for one simple reason: because they were not wrong. And now he could do nothing else but be angry that they had died for their right decision, and he had been wrong then, but realized it too late. What irritated Rakrak the most, however, was what happened after that. Someone had apparently overheard the conversation between Rakrak and Stargazer, and all the other warriors who didn't care about arithmetic at first went to Stargazer to learn it. From then on, the warriors who were good at arithmetic always died in the front ranks when a battle arose and always made all sorts of sorties uncoordinated with the chief. And then others went to Stargazer to learn arithmetic and so on in a circle. So later, Stargazer taught them secretly, trying not to annoy Rakrak even more. The warrior sleeping soundly in front of Stargazer was the one who first led many other warriors of the clan to learn arithmetic. After him, even those who were not at first at all interested in arithmetic began to come to Stargazer in secret and learn it. He inspired many by his example. Glad to meet the warrior, Stargazer put his hand on his shoulder, but withdrew it for fear of waking up the warrior. Still, how glad he was to see him here. He decided to wake him later, when he had gotten a good night's sleep. After all, it didn't seem like there was much else to do in this place besides sleep anyway. Looking around, Stargazer assumed that he had woken up faster than the others because he had recently died, and the others were still reeling from the lingering effects of death. Still, he was surprised that there was only an endless sea of grass, and that was all. He wondered, wasn't there anyone divine in this place? Anybody at all? He said it loudly, but his voice just dissolved into the endless green field. Stargazer hesitated. He wasn't as bold as Rakrak and the other warriors, and was a little shy, thinking that the god might overhear. Even when Rakrak pointed out that Stargazer was one of the chosen, he didn't know what to make of it. He couldn't understand why him and what was so special about him that God had chosen him among the others. There were many questions in his mind. Why did the blue insect god save them, protect them, and help them with miracles? Yor said it was because lizard people were better than other species. But is that really the case? The other species seemed to lose either because they didn't have a god, or their gods weren't as powerful as their own. Owen said it was because the god was good. But how are lizardmen better than other species? Are other species not as good-hearted as us? Jael said that God chose the lizardmen because they were helpful. Then was it right for them to rely on God? What if one day they stopped being useful? Stargazer thought Raycrack's answer was the best among all the others. Even if he wasn't right, Raycrack always offered answers that Stargazer liked. Raycrack said that the fact that God had chosen them could have been a coincidence. That maybe they had no choice but to be the best species in the best land. Maybe God did the best he could, and they were simply the best option among those available. It sounded disrespectful in a way, but Stargazer thought it was okay. It was getting hot after being out in the sun for so long, but there was shade in the forest that had discreetly appeared not too far from the field. This place really had everything. He started humming because he was in a good mood. It was the tune everyone sang after the black-scale lizards defeated the frogmen and the villages were rebuilt. It had a good rhythm, so everyone liked it, but Stargazer didn't always hum it because he wasn't very good at singing. He was even embarrassed to hum it, so he only did it when no one was around. And then he heard a rustle. Suddenly some movement caught his eye. Someone nearby was moving among the trees. Stargazer began to wonder who it was. He saw the tail of a lizard sticking out between the trees, but he never got an answer from it. The tail swayed back and forth and then disappeared. He immediately called out to it again, but there was no answer. Then he began to rise hastily, intending to get close to the stranger and catch him if necessary. He began to ask the stranger to stop and listen to him, for he only wanted to ask him one question. Movement meant that someone was still awake. Who was it then? Could you be someone he knew? Not getting an answer, Stargazer hastily got up and went into the forest, and soon he saw the tail again between the trees in the distance. But the tail disappeared when Stargazer called out to him. He began to walk faster, thinking he might lose the lizard man. Walking fast was awkward, for he hadn't been able to do it until now and had gotten used to it. But then Stargazer decided to remember his youth and started to run, and soon he was running after the lizardman, whose tail appeared and disappeared among the trees. Stargazer remembered that when he was young he liked to run like that. As a child he had run with a friend whose face and name he no longer remembered. He shouted after the stranger, "Stop! Where are you going?" When he passed a few bushes, a small clearing showed up. What he saw there made him excited. There stood a stone building. Stargazer had never seen such a building before. The building was cylindrical, made of rectangular stones, with a domed ceiling. The tail swayed back and forth at the entrance to the building and suddenly disappeared, as if disappearing inside. Stargazer thought that if there was any deity here, he had one question he'd really like to ask. Besides, the lizard man who was always running away from him and brought him here must have been inside the building as there were no other exits. As he approached the entrance to the building, he was thinking for the 100th time, why had God chosen them? Stargazer, whose body was hot from running, quickly climbed the steps and entered the building. A blue light burned at the end of the dark corridor. This light was familiar to Stargazer. As he entered, he kept wondering why they were chosen. Was it because the lizardman race was better than the others? Or was it simply because of the divine benevolent? Or just because they were useful? He didn't know the right answer, but he really wanted to find out. Stargazer walked down the corridor where the blue butterfly led him. As always in his pondering of this question, he decided that Raycrack's answer was the most appropriate. He thought that perhaps it was just a coincidence and not a spur-of-the-moment choice. And perhaps it was simply the result of the best possible choice under the circumstances. It wasn't a bad thing after all. Finally, he found himself face to face with the night sky. The very night sky of the world he knew was projected on the ceiling. The stars were not drawn, but real, shining on their own. And the depth of the dark sky was no different from the real one. The sight took his breath away. He thought, well, you were right, Raycrack. A big stone house. And now, the stars. Stargazer looked around for the master of the tail he was chasing, but the building was empty. However, Stargazer's attention was already on the night sky, not the tail. He scanned it from one end to the other and realized that the sky was moving exactly as he remembered. He believed that God was moving the night sky exactly as it moved. But this was not the end of it. In the center of the room stood a strange mechanical device that looked as if it could be found in the ancient ruins. It was a long cylinder of brass with a round crystal beaker inserted at either end. It was mounted on a platform with a chair to sit on, its whole appearance silently inviting one to look into the strange device. For a moment, Stargazer froze, wondering if he could touch the device. He decided that he could, since no one was around. After touching various parts of the device, he turned his gaze to the bottom crystal glass. He looked at it and couldn't contain his delight. Oh my god, how can this be? Stargazer stepped away from the crystal glass several times to look at the night sky with his naked eye and looked into the glass again. He loosened and tightened the handle of the cylindrical-shaped device. He couldn't believe that this was what the stars really looked like. Gradually, though, he came to that conclusion. This is exactly what they looked like. This star would go this way, and this one would go that way. His calculations were very rudimentary, but he checked it over and over again, and recalculated it over and over again to be absolutely sure. Now he was sure that everything he knew before was so superficial. How much more he had to learn. Stargazer stared uninterruptedly through this mechanical device, never tiring of it, as a thought suddenly occurred to him. It would be wonderful if he could pass this knowledge on to those still alive. That would be truly amazing. He didn't even notice that Seong-un himself was standing behind him, watching him closely. According to Stargazer, knowledge of the stars was a way of calculating, and if a person could calculate, he could determine the size and location of everything in the world, which would allow him to predict what would happen in the future. But as far as Stargazer could remember, there had never yet been a case of anyone from the dead coming back. Then, if one cannot return after death, why did God create this place? Just to see the old lizard man be happy? Stargazer knew it couldn't be. God always does everything to his best advantage. He does nothing for nothing. This knowledge would surely come in handy in the future. The God that Stargazer wanted to meet all along was standing right behind him, and he was quite pleased with the way Stargazer followed him. Stargazer's assumptions proved to be correct. After all, the afterlife would affect the views on life itself, life after death, and the values of those who believed in their God. If warriors went to the afterlife, their kind would dream of Valhalla, and if immortals with special powers went to the afterlife, their kind would dream of a beautiful, peaceful, and flourishing place. What if a scientist went to the afterlife? Then it would definitely lay the groundwork for thorough research and discoveries that would lead to technological breakthroughs. The afterlife would sometimes change and lead to unforeseen results due to attacks from other players. But for now, the afterlife created by Seong-un was starting out perfect and functioning as it should. Seong-un cast one last glance at Stargazer's back before descending from the platform and exiting the first observatory he had built himself. At the same time, in the real world, the clipped ear tribe that possesses superior ironworking technology over what the lizardmen had at their disposal. In addition, they had managed to tame the fearsome saber-toothed tigers and were now preparing for a major war. The development and behavior of this tribe of gnolls was unusual, and it unmistakably indicated that there was also a player behind their actions. He had his own plans and his own strategy, and for sure many trump cards up his sleeve. So Seong-un had a lot to prepare before going to war with the other players, and this one specifically. It was going to be an exciting battle of wits and strategies on the chessboard, with the price of error being the highest. Now that Seong-un had an afterlife, he should have tackled the next point of his plan, and prepare an appropriate reception for those pesky gnolls, to crush them once and for all and make them just another stepping stone on his lizard tribe's path to complete dominance in this world. Seong-un was determined to prepare a proper welcome for his opponents, one that would leave them no chance. But for such a fitting welcome, there was still a lot of preparation to be done, gathering all the necessary information, utilizing all his resources, all his insects. In this perished world, players are slowly expanding their controlled territory. But that doesn't stop players from using their controlled creatures outside of their territories. And Seong-un took full advantage of this opportunity by investing a lot of his resources to mess with his neighbors. He even developed 3 main levers of influence over neighboring areas and players based on his specialization in insects. The first leverage is a group of locusts called a swarm. With the help of a swarm of locusts, Seong-un could control the development of civilizations that relied on farming, but he was careful not to draw attention to his actions. His next tool was to spread disease and viruses using his beetles. Having used them against the frogmen, Seong-un did not stop there and continued to develop new pathogens. In this way, he systematically expanded the list of diseases he could use against other civilizations. And finally, the last tool was the nest, which he built in the controlled area and where he grew his beetles in such quantity that they ravaged the entire area, leaving only desert behind. That was the end of the tools he could directly control, but that was not all. Due to the power, fame, and influence of the Rakrak tribe, the weaker lizard tribes around them decided that it would be more profitable and safer for them to submit to the black-scale lizards and form an alliance with them. These tribes joined them one by one. Now looking at the map, he realized that it was only a matter of time before the southern peninsula was taken. But the only remaining question was what to do with those players who behave inadequately and try to interfere with him. And the solution was obvious. They had to be taken out of the equation. but all in good time. Meanwhile, in the lands of the perished world, two travelers arrived at a camp of black-scale lizards. Owen asked one of the passing lizardmen why the camp was so quiet and sad. Had someone died? And soon he received the answer, "The stargazer has died." Owen was saddened. It was a significant loss to their tribe. Then Hui said he had heard of him before, and since that was the case, today was probably not the right day for his visit, so he'd better just go for a little walk and come back in a few days. Owen shook his head and replied, "That's fine. We don't think it's a bad thing if a traveler comes to a funeral. We generally consider it to be good luck." Hui had a logical question. Why do they think that? Then Owen explained that he thought it was good to have another person to share the grief with. Tonight they would talk about the stargazer all night, and when the sun came up tomorrow, Hui would realize their sadness and grieve for the stargazer as his friend. Hui thought for a moment and nodded, which made a little sense. Owen and Hui walked through the tents and headed towards where the funeral was being held. All the black-scale lizards recognized Owen, so the two of them made it to the funeral site without any problems. There, a lizard with a sturdy build and buffalo horns on his head stood near the burning altar. He wasn't wearing anything too ornate or unusual, but from the way the other lizardmen were treating him, they could tell that this was a high-ranking member of their society. Hui immediately took notice of him as his figure stood out from the crowd. The lizardman stood closest to the altar, and Hui guessed correctly. It was Rakrak himself, the leader of the tribe and their high priest, and tears were pouring from under his bone mask. Hui noticed this and immediately asked Owen if it was normal for a tribal leader to shed tears. At these words, Owen's eyes became big and round, as if he couldn't understand what Hui meant. Then he asked, "Aren't humans like that? Don't you cry when you're sad?" Of course they cry, and their chiefs cried too. But human chiefs tried not to cry in front of their tribe in public to preserve their reputation. Reputation? Owen didn't know that word. He knew what respect was, but not reputation. Hui sighed slightly. Different species had different values that were hard to understand and explain to others. That was the way it was, even though they all spoke the same language. Fortunately, Hui didn't have to explain completely, and from the beginning, what reputation meant. Owen had met a lot of people when he was a vagabond, and he understood almost immediately what reputation meant. For him, thanks to examples, it wasn't that hard to understand. If a tribal leader showed a weak side, the warriors would think the leader was a weak man. Still, Owen advised Hui not to try to explain it to the other lizards. They just wouldn't understand it. Hui wondered why he thought that. Didn't he figure it out quickly himself? Owen then explained to him that there was something they considered more important than reputation. Owen and Hui watched tears roll down Rakrak's face and drip to the floor. When Hui had already asked what was more important than reputation, and Owen replied that there were many things more important than reputation, Rakrak suddenly turned to face them, gently wiped his tears, and greeted his old friend. He was glad to see Owen, while behind them Hui was lost in speculation as to what could be more important than reputation. Glancing at the burial pyre burning out, Owen declared that he was too late. But Rakrak reassured him that he was late, but not too late, and he still had a chance to see the stargazer off. Owen and Hui moved closer to Rakrak. Owen said, "Your words make me feel a little better, Chief." Then Rakrak asked, "Who is that human friend next to you?" Owen explained, "I met him on my way here. His name is Hui. He's a messenger from Automation. He said he came to deliver the words of the Lord of Automation." Hui bowed courteously to Rakrak and personally introduced himself. "I am Hui of Automation." Rakrak looked at Hui and called Owen over to him. Rakrak and Owen exchanged a few whispers with each other, and Hui, who had good eyesight and hearing, tried to overhear what they were talking about, but heard nothing. While Owen whispered in Rakrak's ear that he had a bad feeling about this messenger and the chief should be careful. Rakrak looked at the messenger carefully, keeping a friendly expression on his face. One look was enough for him to assess him and realize what to expect from him. Hui was a little prepared for what might happen. He wouldn't be surprised if lizardmen warriors jumped out of the tents and attacked him, or if Rakrak drew his sword and killed him himself. However, nothing of the sort happened. So Hui entered the largest tent with Rakrak to negotiate. Rakrak calmly said to Hui, "You must have come a long way, but I am sorry. We will have to stay up all night tonight, so I want to get right down to business and resolve things quickly." Hui was only too happy to resolve things quickly. Rakrak began by asking what brought the messenger here. Hui began by respectfully taking a pouch out of his pocket and holding it out to Rakrak, saying, "To begin with, please accept this gift from Lord Chadinson, especially for the leader of the lizard tribe." He still hoped to placate Rakrak with gifts. Rakrak opened the pouch. Inside was a piece of stone of a murky white color. As soon as Rakrak held it in his hands, he knew immediately what it was. It was rock salt. Rakrak already knew it was not an easy gift to give. Salt was a valuable thing in itself, and to give a piece of rock salt the size of a fist as a gift was more of an insult. But Rakrak knew that the Lord of Automation had no intention of insulting him with it. There was a lot of interesting things about the gift. Automation had a veritable fortress. There was no other like it to be found at this time on the entire planet. Some farming species put up wooden fences to protect their villages, but they weren't very strong. And earthen ramparts required too much labor to maintain, so they weren't a good option either. Until proper construction techniques and fortress architecture were developed, these types of ramparts were used to protect farming species. But they came with many drawbacks. Automation, on the other hand, was an ancient fortress ruin, and was more than a dozen meters high with many secrets inside. On the earthen wall of the Automation, there were mysterious mud soldiers with a self-repair function that allowed them to automatically rebuild the fortress if it was destroyed. Mud soldiers were slow and dull-witted, so they weren't very useful in battle, but in emergencies they could be used as troops to defend the castle. Automation had geographical advantages as well. There were two ways to get from the north to the northwest of the peninsula. One was through the wilderness, and the other passed through a rugged mountain valley below Automation's castle. It would be difficult for an ordinary wanderer to choose one of them, but those who knew both paths well usually preferred the mountain valley. Firstly, even though the path was uneven, it was easier and less dangerous to follow than the wilderness where one could easily get lost. Secondly, the mountain valley was shorter. And last but not least, because that's where Automation was located. In the wilderness, if a wanderer ran out of water and food, one had to pray for a spring to appear as a miracle. But Automation, on the other hand, at least gave the wanderers water. This meant that Automation could cut off the path to the interior of the continent. Their castle didn't completely cover the middle of the mountain valley, but if Automation had enough troops, they could crush those who passed the castle. Rakrak believed that despite the neutral relationship between the black-scale lizards and Automation, if Automation's men felt they could capitalize on a single betrayal, they would do so without question. Rakrak couldn't say for sure if they would eventually come out to the Greater Land. But the blue insect god is wary of the continent and the northern region. So, it should be safe to pass through this mountain valley. Beyond the mountain valley was a path leading to the north and northwest of the continent. And there was another important thing, just as important as the path. Automation was not just an ancient ruin built in a remote location. Inside Automation was a salt mine. The people inside Automation weren't very strong, so the amount of salt they could mine was small, but it was still salt. Salt was an important resource, especially in animal husbandry. Carnivores and omnivores could maintain sodium levels in their bodies by eating other animals, but this was not the case for herbivores. Herbivores could not maintain their sodium levels by eating only plants. Therefore, they consumed minerals by licking rocks that had salt on them, as well as ingesting soil. However, when herbivores were artificially fed by humans and continued to travel long distances, they rarely, if ever, had the opportunity to consume the minerals they needed. Herbivores whose bodies lacked sodium experienced vomiting or stomach upset due to hyponatremia and eventually died of kidney failure. Salt was especially important for pregnant animals. As a result, it was a critical resource for lizards. Once black-scale lizards became involved in animal husbandry, they constantly required excessive amounts of salt. Salt was also used for more than just animal husbandry. Salt was used not only to season food for cooking, but also for preservation. As livestock numbers increased, it became increasingly difficult for black-scale lizards to rely on smoking alone. Salt was also used for chemical treatments, such as making paint or tanning leather, as well as for washing things and for funerals. Other uses included fertilizer or even currency, but the black-scale lizardmen did not use salt for these purposes. Rakrak was well aware that most of the supply came from Automation. Salt from the far coast was unavailable because it was too expensive to bring inland, and supplies from the salt lakes were scarce because there weren't many of them. Therefore, Automation became the largest producer of salt in the area. The fact that a piece of rock salt was brought from such a place meant only one thing. Huawei confirmed his hunch and repeated that it was a gift from Lord Automation, and their colony was famous for salt production. Rakrak immediately realized that the first time means there will be a second and a third. Huawei smiled and promised there would be more after that. His face was partially hidden by the beard and hood he wore, and you couldn't see all of his emotions. Rakrak smiled too, but not as friendly, nodded and took the rock salt in his hand. Then he made a fist with the rock salt in it. It crumbled and spilled out of Rakrak's fingers. Huawei was shocked at this behavior with the gift. He had expected a warm welcome knowing how important the salt was to the lizards, but all his plans fell apart, just like the salt. Rakrak then said, wiping the salt residue from his hands, "Tell your master that I have accepted this gift well." Huawei was shocked and didn't understand what was going on and asked him, "What did you do?" Rakrak pretended to think about it, then answered him, Oh, you don't know because you don't have a god. It's just one of our rituals. If you sprinkle a small lump of rock salt on the ground, our god will be pleased. That's all you need to know. The men of automation had no god, but Hui knew that the presentation before him was a brazen lie. He stated that it was a gift from the Lord of Automation, Lord Chadinson, and the way Rakrak had treated him was disrespectful. Seeing the look in his eyes, the lizardmen leader explained, "It's just a small piece of rock salt, and I have used it well for the glory of my god. Is that a bad thing?" Hui became indignant. "You know that's not what the gift is about. Didn't I tell you that the Lord of Automation said there would be a second, and a third, and even more times? Their size of those gifts will be larger, so what are you trying to say by your actions?" Rakrak thought for a moment and answered, "I've heard that the Lord of Automation is rich, but sending a man to give such a tiny amount of rock salt as a gift is somewhat extravagant. But you are right. I hope you bring much more for trade next time. It is good that it is not the rainy season, and your journey will be quick." Hui realized that he was facing a very cunning and experienced lizard man and had to hide his anger. However, it wasn't that they didn't understand each other, it was that they belonged to different races and didn't trust each other. Hui could barely contain his irritation. Rakrak completely crumbled the piece of rock salt that Hui had given him. Although Rakrak's actions were rude, it wasn't rudeness per se. It was a way to complete the diplomatic procedure of refusing to negotiate further. In the end, Rakrak got the salt and used it. The Lord of Automation could say nothing against it. Hui suggested, "Let's talk seriously. Why did you refuse the gift? Don't you need the salt?" Rakrak stared blankly at the tent without even turning in his direction. He seemed to be looking up at the stars. He motioned for the man to go home. But the man couldn't just go back with nothing. Then Rakrak turned to Hui and said, "All right, Hui, the man who came from automation. Let's have a talk. Honestly, I don't really like what it's called, saving face and finding hidden meanings in words." Only then did Hui realize what he was getting at and asked, "Are you talking about diplomacy?" Rakrak assured him, "Yes, that's exactly what I'm talking about. I don't really understand all this nonsense. And I don't like it. I like straight talk better." Now Hui had nowhere to go, and he agreed, saying, "Okay, Rakrak, let's talk directly. Why did you refuse?" Rakrak raised a finger and proceeded to explain. "First of all, I don't like to accept offers that others have turned down." Hui looked at him, not understanding what he was getting at, and asked, "What does that mean?" Rakrak answered him patiently, "If someone else turned it down, it means the offer wasn't worth it. It may be a better offer for me than the previous person, but it's still worth reconsidering and offering something better." Hui snickered, but assured Rakrak that this was incorrect and he was wrong. The Lord had made this offer solely for him, but Rakrak knew enough to see through his lies and asked, "Do you really think Owen met you by chance and brought you here because you were lucky?" Hui gritted his teeth. He didn't think the lizards had it so together. Rakrak continued to speak. "Owen told me you came from the north, not the west. That means you came from the desert, not from automation, and across the desert is the Knoll tribe of severed ears. I bet you made the same offer to sulcate their chief, but were refused. Perhaps you refused for another reason, which I will tell you now." Hui listened to him in silence. Rakrak went on to say, "There are no gifts for nothing. I don't believe in that. I think even the greedy gnolls can understand that, and that is why they rejected your gifts." Hui tried to object, saying, "That's not the point. The Lord of Automation is trying to give you salt, without asking for anything in return, and just as a token of our friendship." Rakrak shook his head and continued to speak. "If we accept your salt, we will have to protect you. Am I not right?" Pointing at him with his hand, he explained, "When you humans are locked and surrounded in the castle of automation, we will have to worry about the safety of our salt. If we play along with your diplomacy and you get in trouble, we will have no choice but to turn our attention to fights that have nothing to do with us." Hui said cautiously, "Rakrak, that is what diplomacy is." Of course, Rakrak knew this, but was masterful at playing his part. Then Hui decided to come at it from the other side and said, "It's not necessarily a gift with nothing in return and we can make a decent deal." But that wasn't an option for the lizardmen either. Hui didn't know what to do anymore and asked, "Then why do you reject our offer?" Rakrak laughed and asked, "You really don't know? I'm sure the Knoll chieftain Salcate has already told you." Hui silently listened to the same answer he had heard from the Knoll chieftain. "Why don't we just take over automation? If we kick the humans out, the salt mine and castle of automation will be ours, and we can mine more salt than the humans could sell us. Isn't that right? Now, Hui, why don't you tell me the truth? Or should I address you as Lord of Automation, Hui Co?" To this he could answer nothing. It seemed the fate of their settlement was sealed and diplomacy could no longer help them. Their weakness was too obvious. The ancient ruins of automation towered above the landscape, an ancient relic and many meters of evidence of a bygone era. Its fortress walls, unlike those encountered at the time, held secrets yet to be unraveled. Compared to these high walls, the savages prowling around seemed insignificant. They could not dream of getting inside undetected. In addition to this, guarding all the secrets of this fortress were mysterious mud soldiers, automatons endowed with the ability to self-repair and rebuild the fortress in the event of its destruction. Though slow and dull-witted, they served as a silent, constant defense that kept watch day and night. The strategic value of automation went beyond its imposing presence. This valley held a strange attraction for vagabonds. While the treacherous terrain made the wilderness a risky path, the valley offered a shorter and safer route. Unlike the unforgiving wilderness, automation offered a glimmer of hope in the form of water, a lifeline for weary travelers. Its strategic position allowed automation to control the passage, potentially cutting off access to the interior of the continent and always attracting members of other human and non-human tribes who sought to live peacefully under the protection of the high walls. Although the black-scale lizards maintained a neutral relationship with the automation, the human inhabitants, ever opportunistic, would not fail to exploit any perceived weakness they might have for their own selfish purposes. Automation also owned a salt mine, a valuable resource in the region. But more importantly, it controlled two vital passages leading from the peninsula to the north and northwest. One route, a treacherous trek through the wilderness, was easily avoided by more knowledgeable travelers who chose the rugged mountain valley that lay under automation's watchful eye. Nebula, always wary of the continent and the north, understood how important it was to keep automation safe. Rakrak, with a sly smile on his lips, revealed the third reason. There are no free gifts. Even the avaricious Salkate understood this fundamental truth. Hui tried to convince him otherwise, insisting that salt was given unconditionally, but Rakrak was adamant. Accepting the salt meant responsibility, the burden of protecting it within automation. Any conflict around the castle would draw the lizardmen into another's fight, a price too high to pay for mere diplomacy and a measly handful of salt. And he bluntly told his guest that he knows who he really is. Lord Automation, and he doesn't believe in free gifts from a lord who has personally traveled such a long and dangerous journey, especially if that gift is offered to you by someone who hides his true identity. That was something Rakrak could not accept. But the supposed lord of this mysterious domain, Hui, remained silent and ignored Rakrak's words. This mysterious silence fueled Rakrak's suspicions, and he concluded that since the automation lord did not deny his words, he was trying to test the lizardman's knowledge by saying his name, Hui. According to the lizardman's leader, Hui's purpose was to gauge their reaction and find out how much they knew, and whether Hui's name had any significance in their understanding of automation. Since even in the automation fortress itself, there were only a few people who knew their lord's real name and appearance. It could even be said that only the 4 noble families who were close to the lord and supported him knew him personally. Moreover, all those who were related to the lord all had a part of Howie in their name, and it was rumored that Howie himself had 4 sons and 3 daughters. The deep knowledge of the lizardman chief surprised Hui. Rakrak discerned his disguise and deciphered his true nature by the distinctive Hui in his name, a common nickname in the lord's lineage. The wrinkles on his hands gave away his age, further confirming Rakrak's suspicions. Gathering all these facts together, Rakrak and found out Hui's real name and position. Sighing and recognizing that Rakrak was indeed clever, Hui removed his hood. His weathered face reflected a mixture of weariness and defiance. He no longer played the role of a mere messenger, but stood at the head of automation, carrying the weight of his people's future on his shoulders. Rakrak studied Hui's facial features. Fierce eyes beneath frowning brows, a disheveled beard, and scars from past battles. Hui wondered curiously how Rakrak had such detailed knowledge of his family, for none of the lizardmen were his close confidants. Finally, he himself admitted that Rakrak was right, and that he was indeed Lord Automation and his name was Hui. However, he quickly moved on without insisting on the sources of the information, wanting to understand the other reasons why Rakrak had rejected his offer. He felt that being a lord made absolutely no difference, and he was indeed giving him salt for free. With each revelation, the dynamics of the negotiations changed. Hui's carefully constructed facade was crumbling, leaving him exposed and vulnerable. Rakrak, on the other hand, remained mysteriously calm, his motives and true loyalties still in the shadows. Tense negotiations were unfolding on the stage, the fate of automation and its people hanging in the balance. Diplomacy, Rakrak scoffed, is a fancy word for dancing around truths better spoken openly. That is why I despise her. Hui agreed, recognizing that while gift might not be an accurate word, he thought they were offering a fair exchange. Your price is too high, and even the greedy Salkate who rejected your offer earlier knows it, Rakrak stated. If Raycrack accepted the salt from Hui, the lizards would be obligated to protect automation. If an external or even internal enemy attacked automation, the lizardmen would worry about the safety of their salt and salt mines. Even if this war was started by the fault of automation itself, the lizardmen would be forced to always be on its side. In Raycrack's opinion, that was exactly what Hui's intention was. It's called a deal or transaction, and it will be beneficial to all, Hui stated. So why are you rejecting a deal beneficial to yourself? A grin appeared on Raycrack's face. Salkate should have told you, he remarked, eyes twinkling with pleasure, presenting a frightening picture in front of Hui. Or why don't we just conquer automation, expel the humans, take over the salt mine and castle as our own? It'll be easier that way, and we'll have everything in our hands. Hui recoiled, stunned for a moment. To hear such an answer twice in a row from the leaders of powerful tribes was dangerous. He suppressed his rising anger, however, and met Raycrack's eyes and asked, "Are you threatening to attack us?" "No," Raycrack objected, and a sly smile played on his lips. "Simply offering an alternative more favorable to the lizardmen, far simpler than your diplomatic charades. It is an effective choice, wouldn't you agree? This useless diplomacy will do us no good, which means conquering automation would be a better choice for us." Raycrack was confident in the strength of his warriors and his god, and doubted that the walls of automation could resist their might. Hui flinched, but then seriously looked directly into Raycrack's eyes and said, "Don't take automation too lightly. Humans are not defenseless." "And I never claimed they were defenseless," Raycrack replied evenly. "My calculations predict victory, albeit with some losses. But you hold secrets unknown even to me. Secrets that allow you to continue to exist here. These unknowns worry me. The possible losses they could inflict on my warriors." He leaned closer, voice lowered to a murmur. "Taking automation is not a problem. We serve the blue insect god, whose blessings can crush your tall ramparts and turn your mud soldiers to dust." Hui was silent, and an epiphany came over him. He had heard rumors of Guardian Sratis, a mantis titan who was rumored to have aided the lizardmen in times of war and was considered an avatar of the blue god of insects. Even statues of the creature adorn the markets in automation itself. "And Sratis is not your only concern," Raycrack continued, a predatory calmness in his voice. "We have our own cockatrice warriors and chosen ones with powers you cannot fathom. Imagine how your soldiers would fear thunder and lightning conjured of their own volition." Hui felt the weight of Raycrack's words pressing down on him. He knew of the existence of the Srathis. The lore was too widespread to dismiss. The cockatrice warriors were still unknown, and though he was dubious about the power of the chosen, the image of lightning flashing among his troops sent shivers down his spine. Raycrack's words were a vivid reminder of their castle's vulnerabilities. A heaviness of unspoken possibilities hung in the air. The game of diplomacy had changed dramatically, exposing the dynamics of power. Hui knew that a simple rebuttal would not be enough. He needed a new strategy that would recognize the danger posed by Raycrack, while at the same time offering a solution no leader could refuse. The fate of automation and its people depended on his next move. Raycrack's words pressed down on Hui like a crumbling rampart. Hundreds of lizardmen warriors, maybe more, against a human population with few true fighters. Automation's strength lay in its numbers, but fear was a stronger weapon than a peasant's hoe. Rumors of conflict would turn them to flight, leaving behind hollow ramparts and shattered morale. The tribe of severed ears would sow fear, but the reputation of the lizardmen outpaced them. Despair gnawed at Hui. He had lost this war before it even began. Raycrack sensed his opponent's despair and broke the silence. "You're not afraid to come here alone? So you're making things very easy for us. With your death, automation will be decapitated and will only fall faster." Hui met his gaze and, though he had some misgivings, still replied, "That just as you are confident of defeating automation, I know you will not kill me despite the loss of my disguise. After all, black-scale lizards honor their guests." Raycrack looked at him carefully. "True," he agreed. "But as I said, my tribe stands to gain much from conquering automation. 4 families will crumble into chaos if their lord dies. An easy victory without a leader." "But you won't know who will be the next lord," Hui objected, his voice firm despite the panic growing inside. Raycrack was intrigued, though the lizardmen didn't care for the automation heir. Such a surrender and acknowledgement of his possible death so easily was not something he had expected. So he tilted his head, and the tip of his tail vibrated in anticipation of the details. "Explain," he ordered Hui. Hui took a deep breath, and a spark of hope lit up in his eyes. "Automation has a secret," he began, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "A secret weapon that not even my closest advisors know about. A guardian so powerful that even the blessing of the blue insect god may not be enough to overcome it." Raycrack's amusement vanished, replaced by anxiety. Secrets were powerful weapons, especially if wielded by a desperate opponent. "Oh, what's the secret?" he asked, and his voice lost its former arrogance. Hui leaned closer, a sly smile playing on his lips. "That," he said, "is a story for another day, a story worth bargaining for." There was a tense silence in the room. Rak, whose confidence was shaken, weighed the unknown and the promise of conquest. Could this be a bluff? A desperate ploy to save automation? Or is there really power hidden within those ancient walls? He had underestimated Hui, and it was quite obvious. And underestimating, he knew, could be a costly mistake. Sighing, Rak relented. "And why?" Rak snorted. "Should my tribe care who your successor is? What does automation's heir have to do with us?" Hui thought for a moment, searching for an explanation that Rak could understand. "Imagine," he began, "the game of Go, a favorite here in automation. Lines intersect to form a grid. We place black and white stones, each vying for control. Surround an opponent's stone with 4 of your own, and it disappears. Play until no squares remain, then count the captured stones and the surrounded spaces. The one with the most points wins." He paused, gauging Rak's reaction. The reptilian leader's pupils dilated, a flicker of intrigue in his gaze. Howie continued, "But rules are just tools. What matters is this. I am a stone on this board. So are you." Rak leaned forward, mesmerized. "And the game has begun?" "Yes," Hui confirmed. 2 gods play, using the tribes as stones. The wilderness is the field. One has brought the gnolls, the other the lizards. They want to pit them against each other on this board, creating their own game. And that game could be called automation, for the winner will have it to himself. Rak's silence spoke volumes. He knew, just as Hui knew that he knew. Lizardmen had played a role in the inheritance of automation. Recently, some lizardmen and their followers had approached Hui's children and whispered to them about teeth full of wrath and the blue butterfly, inclining them to believe in their deity. And some of his children began to believe in the gods. Rak's eyes gleamed in the shadows. "You," he admitted, "read as well as I do. You have a fine analysis." Finally, Rak recognized that Hui was right. Negotiating and preaching his faith was better than bloodshed. Conquering automation would not be easy. Its ramparts, built of earth, towered, presenting a formidable obstacle. The assault would have to be fended off by arrows, wooden barriers, rocks, and the blows of spears. The salt mine could be taken with less bloodshed. Unlike previous conquests, they were no longer just a small tribe. Growth required the acquisition of resources, skills, and land. However, Rak had his own reasons. He had not forgotten the struggle for survival in their past. He admired the tenacity of the people, their ability to find shelter in this harsh land. Perhaps peaceful coexistence would benefit both tribes. Perhaps this game of Go could have an unexpected peaceful outcome. Sunwoon had his own reasons for avoiding religious coercion. Finding a second chosen species critical to his strategy, and it could not be accomplished by spending faith points on forced conversions. He needed true believers. They are far more effective. The level of Nebula's divinity he had recently reached had given him many points of faith, allowing him to choose 2 kinds. Unlike the first kind, which focused on a single tribe in his domain, the second kind determined his entire future development. Some viewed the first kind as a stepping stone, passing on skills and discarding them later. But not Nebula. His first choice, the lizardmen, had surpassed all expectations, and he needed an additional species for the next step. Since his goal was to conquer the southern peninsula, which would require crossing enemy lines and the cold northern coast, he needed a cold-tolerant species to support and potentially expand the lizardmen tribe. It wasn't just about conquest, it was about strategic synergy and adaptation. It was time to organize a clash of civilizations, ruled by him and his rival, another god already known to us as hegemony. The winner would receive the prize of the human race, while the loser would bid farewell to his life. Still, a face-to-face meeting with the hegemony seemed inevitable. Perhaps she could provide valuable insights beyond mere reports. Hegemony arrived fashionably late and attempted a friendly bow and greeted him as an old friend, saying, "It's been a while, Nebula." But Nebula wasn't about to play along with him on this, and curtly reminded him of their long-standing feud, effectively quashing Hegemony's attempt at camaraderie. Hegemony objected, citing their past encounters and how much he enjoyed their last game together, which he thought was great. Nebula, constantly analyzing everything, turned to reminiscing. It was a boring memory for him, a simple victory when he was up against the Hegemony's Holy Orc strategy. Another trivial story. Hearing this, Hegemony became indignant. Trivial? Was that game trivial to you? Nebula explained that at first, the first few times he played against players using the Holy Orc strategy, he was worried about whether he could find a counter to the meta strategy. But when he found an effective way to counter it, every next game was already boring and without challenges. Hegemony, visibly embarrassed, hid his face under his helmet. Could there be a humble man hiding behind this avatar? Nebula wondered. Hegemony came to his senses and without giving up hope, declared his intention to finally defeat Nebula. Predictable, thought Nebula, always throwing around empty threats. He questioned the logic of such a conflict, reminding the hegemony of the finality of this reality. The perished world was a battlefield, not a game. To start a war of annihilation between their best forces was strategic suicide. Sun-Woon decided to remind his opponent of this and ask why he wanted to fight right now. For the sake of what advantages? There would be no next round and no next time here. For the loser, this round would be the last round of his life. Hegemony knew this well, and knew it himself. The fate of their chosen species and countless lives hung in the balance. Only time would tell what would prevail in this battle of the gods, reason or rivalry. The perished world was a cruel mistress. Early decisions carried weight, and small miscalculations later had dire consequences. Every victory, every defeat echoed in the game, determining its future. While future games were possible, the beginning of the game provided a wider field of possibilities. In this unforgiving landscape, Nebula and Hegemony, locked in a fierce rivalry, were about to put everything at stake. Hegemony, ever impulsive, craved immediate confrontation. He was known for his distinctive playstyle. At first glance, he seemed simple and predictable, but in conflicts, he displayed animal instincts and made unexpected decisions. He was also good at multitasking. In fact, there were many known cases when Hegemony won thanks to battles in the beginning, and in Nebula's opinion, he himself shouldn't have adapted to what the other persona was good at and get involved in that early conflict. So being a skilled strategist, he understood the risks of early conflict in this game. A war between their leading forces would not just destroy one of them, the winner would be crippled, easy prey for the other players. To avoid that, he proposed another method for the hegemony to decide which of them would win and take back the automation. Nebula was not one to follow his opponent's script. Although he too could succeed in the early skirmishes, there was no point in gambling on hegemony's strength. This wasn't just a battle, it was a conversation, a subtle manipulation. It was obvious that each of them wanted to get one thing: automation. And though hegemony didn't know it yet, Nebula had already won this round by convincing him to go the wrong way in the battle. Deftly redirecting hegemony's suggestion, he steered the duel in the direction he wanted it to go. Contradictory prophecy. This game was now a dance of deception, with players laying contradictory beliefs. The struggle for supremacy had changed. No longer was it a clash of armies, but a battle of wits, a war waged through the very fabric of faith. The perished world held its breath as it watched the two gods play their dangerous game. Would Nebula's calculated approach win out, or would the unpredictable instincts of the hegemony tip the scales? The game had begun, and the stakes couldn't be higher. Prophecy is a skill obtained when the player's divinity reaches level 6. It's like a quest that the player gives himself, and if he fulfills the prophecy, he will receive additional experience points. However, the penalty for failure is also significant. By failing, the amount of experience the player could have gained during this period is reduced due to the absorption of the religious resources invested in creating and spreading the prophecy. If the player is unlucky, he may also receive a penalty, or a negative incident may occur among the creatures loyal to him. A short example of such a prophecy and its impact. A king received a divine message from a blind prophet saying that the king's son would kill the king and sleep with his wife and destroy the kingdom. The king was frightened by this prophecy but could not bear to kill his own son with his own hands, so he ordered one of his subordinates to kill his son instead. However, the subordinate did not have the courage to kill the infant, so he left him in the field and the infant was found by a shepherd. When the infant grew up and became a young man, rumors reached him that the parents he now had were not his biological parents. He went to the prophet to find out the truth. The prophet said that for telling him the truth, he would sleep with his mother and kill his father. Although the young man still loved his current parents, they were not his biological parents, and he left his hometown and set out for adventure. While he was riding in a wagon on the road, he happened to meet a king quarreled with him, fought and defeated him. Then he even fought a kingdom-threatening monster who had the head of a man and the body of a lion. As a reward for killing the monster, he married the queen, who had lost her husband, and became king. A few years later, he learned that the prophecy he was trying to avoid had already been fulfilled. The king he met and killed on the road was his biological father, and the king's wife he married was his biological mother. Upon learning this, the queen, who was his wife and biological mother, hanged herself, and the king gouged out his eyes and threw himself out of the palace. In the end, the kingdom fell. Unlike the confusing example, the skill was fairly simple. The player tasked himself and his subordinates with predicting what would happen in the future, and if the prophecy was fulfilled, he received points of faith spent on relaying the divine message to his tribe, as well as a reward depending on the difficulty of fulfilling the prophecy. For example, I predict that Raycrack will kill a terrible monster, and if I help Raycrack fulfill that prophecy, I get a good amount of XP. However, Perished World players didn't use this skill that often. This was because there was a penalty for failing to fulfill the prophecy. If a lot of faith points were spent on creating a big prophecy, the penalty for not fulfilling it would be even more severe. Points of faith would definitely be lost, experience might decrease, causing the player's level to drop, and if the player was unlucky, their characters involved in the prophecy might be cursed or face an unexpected negative event. If the creator of the prophecy, a god, cannot even control his own destiny, then he is not fit to be a god. Therefore, no matter how simple the prophecy was, the players were obliged to fulfill it. Prophecies that were too simple were not used too often because the number of faith points returned was less than the original number of points used, but they would still be used if necessary, if the player is confident. In Sun Woon's opinion, the best time to use prophecy was now. Conflicting prophecy is when two players make prophecies that contradict each other. For example, player A and player B made a prophecy about person C. Player A would predict that C would die within 3 days, and player B would predict that C would be alive in 3 days. Player A would try everything possible to kill C within the next 3 days, and player B would use every means to protect C from death. Thus, only one of player A or B will fulfill his prophecy, and the other will fail. Thus, one will receive a reward and the other will receive a punishment. This kind of betting is possible without prophecies, but conflicting prophecy is directly supported by the game system, so there is no loophole, and the loser will surely receive a penalty. Unlike verbal betting, in the case of conflicting prophecy, the loser would still be penalized even if they wanted to cheat and didn't want to fulfill the penalty. Therefore, it would be much more favorable to win. Regardless of the fact that the opponent might disagree with the outcome of the bet, Sun Woon just wanted to see his clear benefit if he won. Finally, Hegemony inquired, "So what kind of prophecy should we go with? You should know that the Lord of Automation chooses his successor, right?" Sun Woon replied. Hegemony immediately became indignant for no reason. "Are you playing a trick on me? To find out how much I know about automation?" Sun Woon only laughed off his irascible nature and calmly replied that, of course, not without it. But the main reason why he decided to choose this topic for the prophecy was because it would be convenient to create a conflicting prophecy based on it. Hegemony nodded and said, "Automation regularly chooses its ruler, and that person becomes the ruler of automation. Apparently, the length of time the Lord can stay in power is different every time, and only the automation Lord himself at that time knows how long his term will last." Sun Woon decided to share a bit of information and said that this is why Hui, the Lord of Automation, hides his identity. Because if people knew his identity, then when the next successor had to be chosen, many would seek to take Automation Lord's place and his life would be in danger. Finally, they decided to create a controversial prophecy based on who would be the next Automation Lord. Hegemony opened the system window with his records and asked if he meant that they should choose one of the 5 children of the current Automation Lord. Sun Woon replied that, yes, and the important thing is that the time to choose the next successor is almost here. And the current Lord wants to give his seat to one of his children, and that means there will be 5 potential successors. And they must choose one of the 5 children and predict which son or daughter will be the next heir. Since there will only be one, the prophecies will inevitably contradict each other. And if they both foolishly guess wrong, then they'll just have to accept it as it is. Hegemony immediately agreed. And seeing Hegemony accept the challenge so readily, Sun Woon realized something. Had he also prepared in advance? However, our hero still believed that Hegemony had not prepared as thoroughly as he had, since he himself had long known that something like this would happen and had been preparing for a long time. Hui has 5 potential successors. Would you like me to present you with a list of them and give you a brief introduction if you don't know? Hegemony asked. Sun Woon gladly agreed to this, for it was a great opportunity to listen to his opponent without revealing his knowledge. He himself was well aware of the Automation Lord's children, but he was curious about Hegemony's opinion of them. Then he began in order. The first child, Dan, is a man in his early 30s. He has a strong build and is trusted by Hui himself. I think he's also quite intelligent. 2 of the 4 royal families support him, and he has the best chance of becoming a lord. Hegemony cleared his throat and continued speaking. The second child, Jun, is a man in his 20s. He is the half-brother of the first son and is considered weak. He is not particularly social and does not show himself to others, preferring quiet solitude. Rumor has it that he has no interest in becoming an heir at all, although there is a family that supports him, his mother's family. The third child, Jin, is a woman in her 20s. She has the same mother as the first son, and she often goes out to the outside world and travels. She hides her identity, but gets along well with hunters and bullies. She is supported by one remaining family of 4. The fourth child, Kyung, is a woman in her early 20s. She has a different mother than the first and second children. Rumor has it that her mother is already dead, and Kyung herself was kind of strange in her appearance and behavior, so those around her thought she was cursed. There's something unusual about her, so she's rejected not only by the Automation Lord but also by other members of her own family. Finally, the fifth child, Min, is a girl about 10 years old. People say that she has extraordinary intelligence and is talented in many ways. She was born when the Lord was already in his old age, so he seems to love her very much more than the other children. Now that everyone was briefly introduced and their avatars were in front of them, Hegemony asked, "So what do you think? Should we choose right away? Or do you need time to comprehend all the information?" But Sunwoon had already made up his mind long ago and wanted to decide everything here and now, since if he needed time himself, it would mean giving time to Hegemony, and that was unnecessary. Therefore, he suggested, "Why don't we write and test our predictions in the conflicting prophecy window? If we predict the same thing, the conflicting prophecy will still fail and we can just click no. And if we choose different successors, we can press yes and get started. What do you say?" Hegemony agreed. Sunwoon then opened the system window, Contradictory Prophecy. The system immediately asked, "Do you want to set up Contradictory Prophecy with player Hegemony?" But before he made a choice, he received a warning that if he didn't fulfill the prophecy, he would suffer heavy damage and heavy losses. One should have thought things through well before making such a decision. But each of them was willing to take the risk and confirmed their decision. Now each of them chose who they thought would be the heir. Hegemony chose Huiseo's second child. He was sure that Hui Jun would be Automation's next successor. The Nebula player's prophecy, however, stated, Huiseo's fourth child, Hui Kyung, will be Automation's next successor. When the choice had already been made and they heard what the opponent had chosen, Sunwoon checked Hegemony's face. As expected, he was surprised by Nebula's choice, and that was to his advantage. Sure, the Lord's fourth daughter wasn't an obvious or even strange choice at first glance, but as always, it wasn't that simple. Now that each of them had made different choices, the creation of the conflicting prophecy had to be confirmed. Hegemony regained his confidence and swung with force to hit the system window and confirm the beginning of their confrontation. He was sure as always that he would win. The contradictory prophecy was confirmed, and 2 contradictory prophecies began to spread amongst the automation from an unknown source. Now let's go back 3 weeks later to the conversation between Rockrak and Hui. Automation Lord Huiseo at first tried to ignore the prophecies, thinking it must be the families doing something wrong again. He hoped that they were just rumors that would eventually subside. However, the prophecies did not subside, and it became obvious that they were happening from behind the walls of automation. So he went to the rulers of the 2 powerful tribes to find the source of all these rumors that had been circulating for the past 3 weeks. He didn't understand why Jun and Kyung were the ones featured in the rumors. Contrary to what other family members thought, Huiseo had no intention of choosing his first son Dan as his successor. However, there was talk that the successor would be either the firstborn Dan or the third child Jin, so the prophecies themselves were a bit suspicious because they were at odds with conventional theories. He assumed that someone must have started the rumors on purpose. Eventually, Huiseo hired a man to find the source of the prophecies. It took a long time, and Huiseo even had to go looking for it himself several times, but the source was never found. He kept wondering how could this be. It seemed impossible to Huiseo. Both the children and the family members were confused, for they knew that soon it would be time to choose a successor. Huiseo had managed to get rid of the rumors in Automation Castle, but this time something came from outside. Word had reached all 4 families that the tribe of severed ears and black-scale lizards were approaching the castle, and the gnolls and lizards who seemed to be traitors or vagabonds were taking longer to pass by the ramparts and looking closely. Howie knew they would come someday, but he hoped not at such an unfortunate time. Both of these large tribes were hard to understand, but it seemed to him that they were somehow connected to these rumors. His encounters, however, proved to him that things were very complicated. At worst, the 2 tribes could have formed an alliance and attacked automation, but that didn't seem to be the case. Huiseo had people gather information about both tribes and found out that both tribes believed in different gods. Both tribes had no hatred for each other, but still treated the other tribe with hostility and considered them rivals that they would one day have to fight. Both tribes are huge and could not be trifled with. They probably believe that the wilderness is too small for both tribes and that it should only go to one tribe. While the humans were barely surviving in this automation castle, Huiseo knew that he had to do his best to fulfill his final duty as the Lord of Automation, and decided to risk his life to do so. He felt that there was definitely a connection between the movement of the two tribes and the successor and the rumors, but there was no proof. Even the fact that he still hadn't died after meeting the leaders of the two tribes was strange, and already meant a lot. It meant that Hui himself was nothing more than a small pebble on the playing field, and that gave him a hopeless confidence. He had already decided to remember that he was just a stone on the board. And just like that, Huiseo confirmed his hopelessness. Huiseo was the first to feel the warmth in the tent fade, but Huiseo just endured the cold air of the desert night while the fire died down. Rakrak looked at the dying fire. He broke a few dry twigs beside him and then began to throw them into the fire, thus revitalizing it. After hearing part of Hui's story, Rakrak noticed how much easier things were when diplomacy was left aside and could be spoken directly. Hui was still silent and disagreed with him, but Rakrak continued saying, "You just have to choose one or the other. Salkate or me, the gnolls or the lizardmen, the god of evil teeth or the god of blue insects." He held out his hand hinting for automation to submit to the lizardmen. However, it wasn't that simple for Hui. It wasn't just a matter of choosing one of the two. Others would think that Rakrak was asking him to choose between two precious gifts. In his mind, however, it was more a matter of which would hurt less if he put his head in the jaws of a saber-toothed tiger or a cockatrice. Even in this situation, the choice was obvious to Rakrak, and he said, "I'm sorry you think so, but wouldn't it be better to put the head in the mouth of a cockatrice?" But Hui said that Salkite also said that a saber-toothed tiger would have been better. Rakrak decided to think from Huiseo's point of view. Huiseo wouldn't believe any of the sweet words Salkate or he himself had said anyway, and his doubts were likely the reason automation still existed. "So what are you going to do?" Rakrak asked. "Well, for now, I'm going to take a step back," replied Hui, "and let the saber-toothed tiger and the cockatrice fight amongst themselves. There will be a winner in the end, but the winner will likely be exhausted, worn out, and wounded. I'd prefer it to be half dead, but in the end, it will give me more options. The true face of the victor will be shown." Rakrak easily understood Huiseo's analogy and said that it was like Hui was trying to tell him that he wasn't going to make his choice now, while thinking that what he means to say is that he will decide what to do when the successor is chosen. After all, the distance between him and the successor is greater than the distance between the successor and automation, so he thinks he can use the hostage to do what he wants. However, the successor must be chosen no matter what, and the time to choose is almost here. "What do you think?" Huiseo asked. "It doesn't seem so bad. If you don't care who wins between me and Salkate, the gnolls and the lizardmen, the evil tooth god and the blue insect god, then that's fine. However, it sounds to me as if you have simply accepted your fate as a will-less pebble on a board," Rakrak replied. "I think you are the same," parried Hui. "You can think whatever you want, but you're the same. Sounds like there's nothing I can do to me. And the fact that you're just resigned to your fate is like a stone on a chalkboard. You think it's too late now, but you could have done things differently. Wouldn't it have been better to learn more about both tribes and see which one was better? If only you had realized sooner that you couldn't escape both of us." Rakrak's words cut painfully at Huiseo's heart, but then Rakrak shook his head and continued speaking. "No, you're right. Doing nothing depending on the situation is also a good choice. You are wise, as you are for a human." Hui stood up and a breeze blew into the tent, and the fire flickered. The shadows of the two chiefs facing each other also swayed violently along with the fire. This signaled the end of the conversation. This was where Hui was going to end their conversation, but before he left, he wanted to ask one last question. Looking tiredly at Rakrak, he said, "After all, I'm not the only one who is a stone. You are as well. Only the plank you're standing on is bigger. Doesn't that frighten you? Don't you feel angry, hurt, or helpless because of that fact?" Huiseo meant that Rakrak was also just a toy of the gods. The corners of Rakrak's lips lifted slightly in a meaningful smile, and Huiseo realized that Rakrak didn't think so. However, he couldn't guess Rakrak's answer to his question. Finally, after a slightly prolonged silence, Rakrak promised, "I will answer that question when this is over." Such an answer pleased Hui, and he said, "Good. Though personally, I hope this is the last time I see you or Salkite." Before Hui left, Rakrak asked if he needed to be escorted to the exit of the camp, but Hui assured him it was fine. He came as an errand boy, so he will leave as a regular messenger. Huiseo rose from his seat, threw his leather hood over his head, and walked out of the tent. No one stopped or looked at Huiseo in any strange way, as if Rakrak had already told them something. Huiseo had a sudden thought that this was his chance to spy on the lizardmen, but he quickly dismissed it. After all, it didn't matter anymore. His heart was overwhelmed by heavy thoughts. Huiseo had faced similar situations in the past, and he knew he had to set things straight, rather than doing what his heart told him to do. Huiseo walked through the lizardmen's camp and out into the desert. He looked up at the stars. At least he knew how to determine direction by the stars. After 2 hours of walking in the direction he had chosen, a small low hill appeared. He realized he had come to the right place when he smelled horse manure. Waiting for him was Hui Wu's nephew, who was his adjutant. With him were several other people. He cheerfully greeted the successful return of his lord and carried in his hands new clothes befitting a lord. Hui, however, assured him that, "It is no relief that I have returned safely." Huiseo took off his leather hood and began to remove the old clothes in which he had made this journey, and began to put on normal clothes for a lord. He also shaved the beard he had grown during this time. The beard greatly affected the impression a person made, and it was useful to have when disguising oneself, but now it was not needed. Huawei walked over to his horse, and to all the questions of his subordinates about how everything went, briefly replied, "Nothing has changed. We will proceed as planned." The plan was to do nothing and wait until the fight between the two tribes was over, so as not to be drawn into the war. When Huiseo himself asked how his subordinates were doing, the adjutant said, "I am sorry. I have no excuses. The black-scale lizards are too wary, as is the tribe of severed ears." Huiseo ordered his subordinates to scout the black-scale tribe while he talked to Rakrak. His orders were not just to find out how many there were, how many warriors there were among them, or how many livestock they had. Among the lizardmen in automation were longshoremen, traders, and vagabonds. There had to be an insider from the Rakrak tribe among them. Finding that connection and interrupting it was the only way automation could get out of the game between Salkate and Rakrak. We can't just execute all the gnolls and lizardmen in automation. That would cause resentment in the castle. However, I cannot leave things as they are. We need to find the connection and break it. Huiseo stated in the end. The adjutant assured him, "For the past few days, we've been looking for familiar automation lizardmen, but we haven't seen anyone other than the local lizardmen warriors." Huiseo then said, "All right, there's no way the lizardmen didn't notice them. There must be lizardmen who have been ordered to come to automation and gather information about us. We need to expand our range of reconnaissance." In that case, the adjutant was sure that if they added more soldiers to the scouts, there would then not be enough of them to defend the castle walls. But none of that mattered to the lord. Automation's walls were safe for now. As long as the two large tribes held on either side of the castle, there was no need to worry about physical defense. Even if automation and the high ramparts collapsed, they would rebuild themselves, preventing outside invasion. The real problem was the invisible wall, which was constantly being attacked by various religions, prophecies, rumors, and ideas. Even Huiseo couldn't fully understand the modern concepts of information and psychological warfare, but he vaguely guessed at it. Pondering all of this, they hurriedly returned to their castle.